Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to today's meeting of the Environment Committee. Thank you very much for joining us today as we examine the environmental implications of the proposals to expand Heathrow Airport, particularly in light of potential changes to airspace and similar expansion initiatives that have been emerging from Gatwick, Luton, Stansted, the list goes on possibly. City Airport, in fact. Our discussion today is going to centre on the key areas of noise pollution, air quality, and on the broader climate impacts associated with these proposed developments. But before we get started, I would like to remind everybody to put their phones on silent or switch them off altogether. Don't put them in front of the microphones, because otherwise they will pick up vibrations if you leave it on vibrate. And also, can I just remind everybody, particularly guests, that if you want to move the microphone closer, can you pick it up by the base and not by the gooseneck, because that breaks them and we might have to charge you for that. Members of the public are encouraged to follow at London Assembly on various social media platforms. If you're using X, you can also use the hashtag Assembly Environment for this meeting. We've got a few very short items of business to cover before we come to our main discussion item on Heathrow today. Could I ask our committee officer, Sal Fazal, to confirm whether we've received any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assemblymember McCartney, for whom Assemblymember Small Edwards is attending as a substitute. Assemblymember Prince has also sent his apologies.
And very welcome to Assemblymember Small Edwards, who I think is attending his first meeting of the Environment Committee.
That's correct.
The second item on the agenda is declarations of interest, which are found on pages 1 to 4 of your agenda pack. Could I ask the committee to note the recommendations at item 2? And ask if any members have got any other interest that they need to declare? No? OK. Item 3 is the minutes, which are found on pages 5 to 42 of your agenda pack. Could I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of September as a true record that can then be signed by me? Confirm. Thank you. The summary list of actions is at item 4, which is pages 43 to 46. Could I ask the committee to note the completed, closed and ongoing actions? Thank you. Item 5 is actions taken under delegated authority. Could I ask the committee to note the recent actions taken by me under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's reports as outlined in the agenda report and included as appendices 1 and 2? And I think we've got a lot of coverage for the report on Stonewall Rivers, and I would like to thank the previous chair, Assemblymember Polanski, for all of his work leading us towards that report. We've also had some responses to committee outputs, pages 117 to 122. Could I ask the committee to note the responses received from the Mayor of London to our letter on managing London's trees in a changing climate as attached to Appendix 1 of the agenda report? Finally, brings us on to the environmental impacts of the proposed Heathrow expansion. We've received a briefing and a report on this, and we have a number of guests who are with us today. We have Paul Beckford, who is the Policy Director of HACAN. We have Celeste Hicks, who is here from the Aviation Environmental Federation. We have Christina Calderato, who's here from TfL. And finally, last but not least, we also have Tracy Woltho, okay, I've got that right, who is here to speak on behalf of CISHA, which is the Council for the Independent Scrutiny of Heathrow Airport. And how do you pronounce that? CISA, okay. CISHA? CISA. Okay, almost unpronounceable, I've decided, because I can't pronounce it, so I've decided it's unpronounceable. So we're going to start with a couple of questions from me, if I may, and I'm going to start with Paul from HACAN. And then I'm going to come on to Celeste at AEF and then to Christina from TfL. What are your views on the proposals for a new runway at Heathrow? What are Hakan's views?
Nice, easy question. So HACAN's existed in various forms since the 70s, represent communities under the Heathrow flight paths, and we've long opposed any expansion of Heathrow, be it through a runway or increased air traffic movements. So you won't be surprised to learn, sorry, I'll sit further forward, you won't be surprised to learn that we're opposed to a third runway and any increase in flights for local communities. It's quite difficult to talk about the detail of the current proposals, as there's a couple live and government have yet to decide which one they're going to back, and the detail we have is in the public domain is fairly scant. So we have to base our view and discussion today really on the previous proposal from 2018, which was voted on in Parliament. And you're talking about a huge increase in number of flights, 250,000 more. That's going to impact people across London and the home counties in terms of noise pollution, air pollution, before you get into the carbon emissions, which I'm sure we'll touch on later on. You're potentially doubling the number of people that are exposed to harmful levels of aircraft noise. And the frustrating thing from our perspective is that you're seeing academic evidence increasing over the years that shows that noise has harmful impacts on health, physical and mental, at lower levels than we've previously thought. So we're always campaigning both in discussions with Heathrow and with government departments to make sure that that evidence is front and centre of policy and is reflected properly in where triggers for mitigation and compensation come into play, but also to try and make sure that respite is really protected. It's something our members really value, that ability to where the runways alternate, and obviously a third runway will reduce that. Now, Heathrow claims that they will protect alternation, but the reality is that will reduce maybe half a day's respite to a third for many people. And the big impact for us, and links to the airspace change programme, is that you're going to get potentially greater concentrations of noise, and we don't really understand the health impacts of that, and we need to do that. We need to factor that into the programme, and so those people who are already overflown are at risk of getting more noise, a greater risk of health effects. And there's also lots of communities who will be newly impacted if expansion goes ahead. And these are people maybe who've deliberately bought their house to be away from the current flight paths, and that's all about to change, irrespective of whether a third runway is ever built or not. I can say plenty more about that, but perhaps I'll leave it for later.
I think I might stop you there, because we've got a number of questions that are going to delve into those issues, as you rightly guessed. But I think that's very helpful that you set that out. Celeste, same question.
I mean, I won't take too much of your time. I mean, we broadly agree at Aviation Environment Federation with everything that Paul said. I mean, I'd just add also that one of the objections that we have as well is about the role of ultrafine particles, and that they're not currently properly regulated, and we don't know enough about them, and they have flown under the radar, to use an aviation terminology. And also, we're really concerned about the impact on the UK's ability to meet its Climate Change Act obligations and carbon budgets. If this goes ahead, we assume it's going to be opening around the middle of Carbon Budget 6, and it's going to have a huge impact on our ability to meet that well into the future. So, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything Paul said on noise for local communities, and also just the impact of extra traffic and construction emissions as well. But, I won't say too much more, because he's said it all.
Thank you very much. Christina, what's the view of TfL on the proposals for a new runway at Heathrow?
Yes, so I mean, the Mayor's been really clear that any proposals for expansion at Heathrow needs to be shown to be compatible with his environment and transport objectives. So I think we do have a number of serious concerns around things people have already mentioned, so noise, carbon emissions, air quality, and I think one of the things that we feel really strongly about is that we've done a lot in London to improve our air quality, and what we don't want to see is those gains being kind of being seen as headroom, if you like, to be taken up by more emissions as a result of Heathrow expansion. And then, of course, surface access is one of our really big concerns as well. So if we're going to have this kind of...
I'm going to have to constrain you on the surface access element, because we are the Environment Committee, and I don't want to have my legs chopped off by the Transport Committee, because we discussed all the transport areas. But if you can stick to the air quality, climate and all of those areas.
Chair, without wishing to cut across the authority of the Chair, surely any all of the surface, that will have an environmental knock-on as much as a transportation knock-on. So I think it perhaps...
I can steer clear of capacity and talk about the importance of the sustainable travel because of the environmental impact it would have if we saw that growth catered for by lots more traffic coming in, which I think is probably where that kind of really stems from. So I think that's probably a safe place for me to leave it. Is there was previously a commitment to have no increase in highway traffic. That's the kind of thing that would be really important for us to see.
Absolutely. Okay. No, that's fine. We could just delicately negotiate between the remits of the two committees, because I'm fairly sure that Transport either has or is about to go into all the details around capacity and additional surface access by transport. But yes, that would be great if you can sit to the environmental impacts of any changes that may flow from that. So my second question, which is to everybody, is would the impacts significantly differ between the two proposals which are in the public domain, which are the one from Heathrow itself and also one from Aurora? I understand there might be another 5 that nobody has actually, they're all secret or they're somewhere, but we haven't seen them. Heathrow's proposals for a new runway is for a longer 3,500 metre runway, and it's slightly further northwest, and Aurora's proposals are for a shorter 2,800 metre runway, so one and slightly to the north of the airport rather than northwest of the airport, is my understanding. Do you think there'd be any significant difference in terms of noise, air quality, climate, particulate matter or anything like that? I'll start with you, Paul, and then I'm going to work down again.
No, is the short answer. It's potentially you might actually take up more homes with the Aurora scheme in terms of compulsory purchase and destroying those houses. The noise impacts are broadly similar. They're talking maybe a few thousand less ATMs, but you're still going to impact a massive amount of new people from noise. Carbon emissions are the same because there's still going to be the same planes flying on whichever scheme happens. The Aurora one, I believe, is slightly less complex in that they're not proposing to go over the M25, but the wider impacts in terms of the people impacted are going to be broadly the same, whichever scheme is chosen. And I believe the other 5 have been kicked out by the department, but that's maybe not be on the record, so it is now.
It could be breaking news, so at least to us, anyway. Celeste.
I mean, it is difficult to analyse them in any more detail than what was publicly available. But yeah, we understand that the Aurora one, the main, if you want to call it an advantage to that, it's just a little bit easier to deliver because it doesn't involve tunnelling under the M25. So obviously we'd be concerned about the Heathrow proposal if it stays in its current form, or as much as we know from the previous attempt. To do that work on the M25 is going to be incredibly costly. There'll be obviously all kinds of construction emissions from the actual road construction, as well as, you know, massive delays. I know we want to steer into the actual transport access or the surface access of it. But the other thing to really bear in mind is who pays those costs as well, because previously there was not a clear agreement on whether it was the public purse that would pick up some of the tab for those road improvements, or whether it would be the scheme promoter. And as far as I'm aware, I don't think any details been put out on that as well.
Well, we have some guests from Heathrow who will be on our next panel, and I believe, in fact, they might be just behind me in the public gallery, so hopefully we'll be able to ask them that question. Christina, any thoughts from TfL as to whether either of the two proposals is better than the other, or are they both as
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a similar answer, really. Probably the devil lies in the details, so you'd really want to see what the kind of detailed proposals were to understand what the kind of differences are between them. But I think there's probably nothing in addition to what others have already said.
OK. Tracy, from the perspective of the independent council, and you're scrutinising what Heathrow is up to anyway as an airport, but also these proposals, do you think there's any difference between them, really?
Thank you. So I should just say I don't think I was asked to answer the first question because constitutionally we don't take a position on Heathrow's expansion. Our role is a diplomatic one in some ways, to bring communities together and to be able to work with Heathrow to influence them, to take account of community views. And it's not helpful for us to take a position to support that good dialogue. As others have said, the detail isn't yet there, I think, to be able to draw strong conclusions about the differences between the schemes, but the land take implications of the Aurora scheme do, we think, take more homes, and so that would be important. To the extent that the runway is slightly closer to population centres within London, that could have greater noise effects as well. But there is nothing in either of the propositions that would allow you to do that very detailed, confident assessment at the moment.
Okay. And could you set out in a bit more detail then, obviously you have that ongoing monitoring role. What is your role in the process around the new runway proposals? Are you being involved by the government in the development of the proposals and looking at how they land with local people or what?
Thank you. Well, we will have two roles. So our first role is formally set out as an airport consultative committee to make sure that there's a forum in which the airport can engage with local stakeholders, and we've certainly had lots of active discussions with both Aurora and Heathrow as the two promoters and our membership in terms of the development of the schemes, but they're at a very early stage. The perhaps more significant role is set out in the airport's national policy statement, which says that there should be a community engagement board, which will ensure that local communities can play an active role in developing the airport. We are not party to the detailed discussions and decisions that the Department for Transport will be taking at the moment. I would be surprised if our role were to disappear from the next iteration of the airport's national policy statement. But we would, I think, we are in a preparatory phase to make sure that as and when the airport's national policy statement is passed and gets through Parliament, and there's a lot of ifs in there, of course, we would be ready to help local communities engage in detail on designs, operation and so on. To be discussed with the Department for Transport, we started those discussions. I think there is also a role for us in helping people respond to the next consultation on the airport's national policy statement. So my predecessor body, our role didn't exist when the airport's national policy statement was first consulted upon, but we think there is a role to help local communities get their points across and make sure that they can be heard by government.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on to one of my colleagues, Assemblymember Roberts, but just before I do, for full transparency, and just in case any of you are not familiar with this, I represent Merton and Wandsworth, and obviously the Wandsworth part of my constituency is considerably overflown by flights that are coming in on the westerly direction into Heathrow. Assemblymember Roberts, who's going to come in next, represents Kingston, Richmond and Hounslow, and Assemblymember Mafus, who's also here today, represents Ealing and Hillingdon. So you have quite a number of Assembly members on this committee who represent essentially areas that are going to be quite heavily impacted by, well, are impacted quite heavily already and would be impacted by any changes. That said, I'm now going to pass over to Assemblymember Roberts.
Thanks, Chair. Good afternoon. With Heathrow to the west, Luton to the north, Stansted to the east, Gatwick to the south, and as close as the centre that you can get, we've got City. Is there need for additional capacity at London's airports? Anybody that fancies a go at that?
I can have a go at it. I mean, this is something that we feel quite strongly about. In 2013, the Airports Commission did a national survey of airport capacity, and the question was about a third runway capacity needed in the southeast of England. And there was 2 years' worth of work done on that, which led to the establishment of the airport's national policy statement. And the outcome of that was that there was one runway needed, and it would be at Heathrow, and that was the chosen scheme. And then obviously, you know, fast forward now, we've had the pandemic, we've had all other things that have kind of taken precedence for that. And I think it's important to note that currently that is still the position. The ANPS does endorse a third runway at Heathrow. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, we're not agreeing with that, but it is very strange that we now have Gatwick given the go-ahead, given that under that very detailed process, which took all of the same evidence that you will be asking, that everybody's been asking, and went into all the modelling and all the details, that the conclusion was that that wasn't needed at Gatwick. And that's without including the expansions at Stansted, Luton and London City. So we feel at Aviation Environment Federation that it feels like there's some kind of free-for-all on airport capacity. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind is the impact on airports in other parts of the country. For example, Manchester Airport, if all the traffic comes to the southeast, what impact does that have on jobs and growth in those regions? I mean, we think there's a lot of scope for some kind of national airport strategy that would maybe try to get into some of these questions, but it is disappointing that this work has been done previously, specifically looking at the London capacity, and it seems that the government has now moved on and just ignored all of that work, and we're kind of back where we were with another 4 airports expanding on top of it, all in the same area.
Thank you. We will be touching in a moment on the national aviation strategy, or the truly national one, so I may be coming to you on that next. But Paul?
Just to add to what Celeste said, is that the capacity that's being delivered by the other airport expansion, Stansted, Gatwick, London City, Luton, is more than the capacity that would be delivered by a third runway. So in terms of that capacity need that was addressed as part of the Airports Commission process, it's already being delivered. And that was on the premise that we could have that capacity expansion and still meet our climate obligations. So if that's happening over here, and then you throw a third runway on top of that with extra capacity, but also a huge amount of millions of megatons of emissions every single year, you're blowing the chances of the country meeting those obligations out of the water entirely. And then there's a wider conversation about, well, what does that mean for other sectors that are looking to decarbonise, and how does that impact them and regions, as Celeste highlighted. So it's a very strange place that we find ourselves in.
Indeed. Looking, can't see. Okay, so I'll move on to my next one. So, Paul, with you, so I mentioned a moment ago, in your submission to the Environmental Audit Committee, you stated that the UK is lacking, and I use quotes here, lacking a truly national integrated aviation strategy. What would such a strategy look like?
Well, it's very, very honoured that you've taken the time to read our submission, Gareth, and the national strategy will be looking at all these factors holistically. So as Celeste has talked about, and it comes up with national emissions framework, so you can look at each expansion proposal in the round and decide at what point do we need to say that's enough, because we are in danger of undermining our targets. We have no strategy really for how we're going to properly decarbonise aviation. The Jet Zero strategy that the government has at the moment is being challenged in the courts because it basically pushed all the hard decisions into the future governments, and if you're trying to encourage private sector investment to deliver this sort of innovation, you need to give them certainty, and the strategy doesn't do that. They're banking on a whole range of technologies that don't exist at this point and may not exist in time for the decarbonisation targets that we're trying to hit. And you've got a really big trade-off as well between reducing emissions and reducing noise through different technologies and different engine types and airframes. And aircraft that are flying today are going to be flying in 2050 by and large. They've got that long-term framework. So we have no overarching framework at looking at that. We also have outdated policy. Some of the you've got Airports National Policy Statement is 2018. Based before that, you've got the Aviation Policy Framework from 2013. These are still live policy documents which govern these different bits of aviation. You've got a bit of noise policy over here. You've got a bit of an air pollution policy over here, and none of it's brought together. So all these disparate bits are also responsible to different departments in Whitehall. So you have that silo operation, which then has an impact. So if you could bring those together, and hydrogen is often touted as an example for long-term decarbonisation. But how are you going to get that hydrogen to airports? How are you going to store it? How is it going to be transported around the country? We don't have the infrastructure to do that. And that, again, takes time and years of planning and investment. So you need to bring these things together and start looking at it in the round and say, here, we've got a whole set of airports, not just in London, but around the country. People want to come to the UK, they want to do business in London, but they've got a choice of airports. So how do we improve the public transport access to get them to those airports? All these things are done sort of piecemeal in different policy documents, and there's nowhere bringing it all together. So an integrated framework, and I know government is looking at an integrated transport strategy. I'm not sure how much aviation will factor into that, but we'll be looking at all of these things in the round and trying to bring a sort of clear pathway that says, here's where we think we can have growth, if we think we can, and here's how it can be achieved. And I think that's probably where I'd start from.
Okay, thank you. One of the other things that we need to consider, I mean, at the moment it always seems to be about expansion. But of course, there's airspace modernisation. Does anybody have views on how that improvement in airspace modernisation might have an impact on London's airport capacity?
Yeah, I'm very, very happy to offer a view. I think the airspace modernisation programme is hugely complex. You're talking about the redesign of the entirety of the airspace across London and the South East. You've got hundreds of thousands of flights going every year, and there are potential wins there. If it's done correctly, you can potentially reduce some of the stacking, you could reduce some of the queuing that people have experienced when they're flying in and out of London, and that might save some emissions. However, the whole purpose of the programme is to enhance the capacity of the airspace, and that means you can put more planes into it. You're also moving away from what is radar technology onto satellite navigation systems, effectively, for aircraft, which allows you to fly them closer together, greater concentration. So the risk there is where that's happened in other parts of the world. The communities who are overflown get a greater intensity of noise, more frequent, and more exposure to that noise pollution. So there's potential downsides of that as well. And again, there's a trade-off between, how do you design those routes? Do you do it to save emissions? Do you do it to save noise? And it gets complicated in policy in that noise is the priority below 4,000 feet. Above 7,000 feet, it's carbon emissions. Between 4,000 and 7,000, there's a balance. And the guidance as well, at the moment, the government are about to consult on their navigation guidance, which will potentially change, may change, I don't know, how these things are factored into airspace design. Of course, then you add a potential third runway on the top of that, you come up with a whole different set of flight paths for Heathrow with a 2 runway than you would do with a 3rd runway, and that has an impact on other airports' abilities to operate and the way they can run their flight paths. But also it creates a huge amount of uncertainty for overflown communities because you don't know which one's coming. And this is, so I've been doing this role nearly 5 years. We've been, going through the airspace modernisation programme that whole time. Government are just about to redesign the governance structure of that process with a new UK airspace design service, and there is a concern that that's inserting a new layer of bureaucracy, effectively, and removing some of the opportunities for communities and environmental campaigners to have their voices heard. So whilst there's a potential benefits, the whole programme is predicated on enhancing capacity, which only by and large will bring disbenefits to communities.
Thank you. One final question. This one's to Christina. What role does the Mayor have in influencing airport capacity for London? Indeed, can he influence it? If the government's hell-bent on growth at any cost, can he influence it?
Yes, is the short answer, I think. So the Secretary of State for Transport obviously has the final say through the DCO process, but the Mayor can exert quite substantial influence. So primarily through the planning process and through his policies, so the London Plan and environmental duties. We obviously at TfL have responsibilities for the sustainable and effective operation of the transport network, and the Mayor is a statutory consultee. So although he doesn't have the final say, there are lots of opportunities where the Mayor's concerns and TfL's concerns need to be factored into that decision-making, and that's kind of formalised, if you like, through those processes. So there is a real opportunity to influence there. And I think both the Mayor and us at TfL will be using all of the kind of formal and informal options open to us to make sure that we're continuing to kind of advocate for what Londoners need and making sure that those kind of needs are met and catered for and considered in those processes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I had an indication that Assemblymember Thomas Turrell might want to come in at this point, and I suppose because I was mentioning everyone else's constituencies, he represents Bexley and Bromley, but of course if all the expansions go ahead everywhere, then pretty much all of London is going to have extra flights. But over to Assemblymember Turrell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to toe very close to the line, I think, with these questionings, just to forewarn the just to forewarn the Chair. But I do think it's really important that actually, as a committee, we understand the wider context. Obviously, the lead of question to this was around the need for airport capacity, but there's different types of capacity demand. So I'd like to ask the committee, I'd like to ask the panel whether it is all airport capacity you feel that we need, or whether it's specifically greater hub capacity. Yeah, I'll throw that over to whoever wants to dive in first.
I'll have a go at first. It depends whose argument you want to buy, I suppose. Heathrow is the only hub airport in the UK, therefore they would argue that you need greater hub capacity. I think if you look at the way that flight is changing, that it's a global industry. You've got new hubs across the world, Istanbul, Dubai, that are shifting the way that the airlines fly compared to how they used to do. Heathrow, like 50%, I think, of like BA's flights out of Heathrow go to New York. That's the busiest route. That's where they make their money. So, whose interest is served by facilitating that hub? The hub relies on short-haul aviation, which you could argue that we shouldn't be flying anywhere in the UK, arguably, other than if you're in the sort of Highlands of Scotland to get into to London. There's perfectly good public transport options available. So, and there are also arguments that London itself is the hub. When you speak to businesses, they want to come to London. They don't care if it's Heathrow, City, wherever. They just want to come here, and they can do that. There's 5 airports around, so there's plenty of capacity, arguably, there. So I would argue against it, and I would also suggest that the hub economics seem to be shifting globally as well. You're seeing change in aircraft fleets to longer haul point-to-point destinations because aircraft can fly longer. That's where people want to go. They don't want to transfer. And for the travelling public, they don't care either, right? They don't care if they're hubbing out of Heathrow, Schiphol. Doesn't matter to them. Who it matters to is to Heathrow shareholders because they want them to transfer there. But the interesting thing there around the expansion debate is that Treasury looked at that and said, well, you can't really count a good chunk of those transfer passengers because they add any value to the UK economy, or you'll risk double counting them because you're getting a connectivity benefit and they're not spending any money here. So you know, a question I would throw back is who benefits from that hub expansion? Yeah, that's probably a starter for 10.
I mean, I would just add on to that. It goes back to what I said about the fact that we had the Airports Commission 10 years ago looking at these questions. I mean, Gatwick has traditionally said it's a point-to-point airport, so it serves a primarily leisure the audience is people wanting to go on leisure flights to a direct destination. I mean, I think it's probably worth asking the airlines what they think as well, because they have quite clear preferences about which airports, you know, depending on the airline, which is the one that they prefer to use. But yeah, there's a lot to be unpicked in terms of the demand case, and you know, I think this came up in the Gatwick decision recently. Was that you know, we questioned in the planning inquiry in the for Gatwick when they heard for the DCO, we questioned this idea that there was demand for both airports, and it was the response from the Secretary of State in the decision letter, which came out recently, was that demand case had been answered. But we would question that because we had some modelling that was given to us from the Department of Transport that argued if the Heathrow third runway did go ahead, then basically most of Gatwick's demand would dry up and they wouldn't have even as many planes as they had in 2019, even with a second runway. So, you know, it does seem quite bizarre when we talk like this that no one actually really does have a proper grasp on these questions, because, you know, if it was any other sort of infrastructure, there would be a clear sort of national policy on it, and it's just lacking on airports.
If I can come back on the Paul, I mean, you said that about Heathrow seeing itself. Is it a case that Heathrow is a hub airport, or does it just self-ID as a hub airport? Because when you look at global competition, when you look at global competition, international hub airports tend to have at least 4 runways and offer more than that. So do you think there's any chance that Heathrow ever could reach 4 runways, or should we be looking somewhere else to meet that capacity?
Well, on that last point, absolutely not. It's two is plenty. We don't need a third one, certainly don't need a fourth one. Although communities will tell you that, of course, you know, at Terminal 5 planning inquiry 20 years ago, they said they want a third runway, and here we are still debating it. So, you know, obviously, people change and move on. But yeah, no need for a fourth runway or a third one. It is a hub airport. Its business model is taking short-haul flights and connecting them, or connecting people flights. It's a point of connectivity. I'm not an airport economist or an operation person, but yeah, that's the big chunk of their traffic is transfer passengers. So that's people coming in, switching planes and going out. So it serves as a hub airport for sure.
I mean, we're not the economy committee, but I presume there must be some economic benefits and some jobs involved in people buying stuff when they're in the airport, when they get off one plane and presumably hang around for a period of time before they go off on another plane. But we're not going to go into that because that's economy, not environment. Instead, I'm going to bring in Assembly Member Zach Polanski, who is a London-wide member, so represents all of the boroughs that I've mentioned so far and many more beyond.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have a constituency to worry about the air noise specifically for, but I do live on the planet, so I want to talk about carbon emissions. But just picking up on that economic point, which I accept we're not the economy committee, but Paul, from what I understand, a lot of this is about tea to Japan or marmalade, about kind of exporting things. Is that really the economy that London needs?
Well, it's a slightly leading question. It's not for me to decide what the economy of London needs. But yeah, there's lots of export that goes through Heathrow for sure. But it's not a freight airport. You know, that'd be East Midlands that serves like that. I've seen somewhere that there's a significant amount of high-end, high-value resources that come in through in the belly hold of passenger aircraft into Heathrow, gold bullion and things like this to help maintain the sort of financial system we have. So you know, that's part of the global economy. How much that benefits people of London is debatable, I'm sure. But you know, there's only about 8 dedicated freight flights into Heathrow a day, so it's not really a freight airport in that regard, although they would probably argue that by value a lot of it comes in through the airport.
Thank you. I don't want to ask you another leading question, so I'll caveat by I'm going to keep my incredulity quiet. But to what extent can airport expansion be compatible with the UK's carbon budget?
I think it can't be if you read what the Committee on Climate Change has said on this matter. And I think the pace of technological delivery to decarbonise is not matched by the aspirations for growth that the sector has. And just on, if the third runway happens at Heathrow, you're talking about aviation constituting 25% of our carbon emissions by 2050, which is a huge chunk, right? That's one sector of the economy. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but we haven't had a national conversation about, well, what does that mean for other sectors of the economy? Should they decarbonise more quickly? How are they going to do it? And I should caveat that by saying, even if that happens, all these technology advances happen by 2050, it's a good chunk, probably 75–80% of the aircraft are going to still be flying on kerosene. So you haven't shifted away from that problem. So yeah, I think it's really difficult to say that. And if it was down to me, I think the emissions framework we've talked about here today is an essential part of that. And then you could say, right, you can have some growth, but up to the point where we know that these technologies come in and they're operational. Because otherwise we're relying on promises and pledges for investment that doesn't happen yet or isn't at a commercial scale. So electric aircraft are happening now. They're around. You may get to maybe a 70, 80-seater electric aircraft, but that's probably never going to fly out of Heathrow. It'd be great for other smaller airports, but it won't be a big chunk of the fleet at Heathrow. So in terms of this is the biggest source of carbon pollution in terms of the aircraft that use the airport. So how do you address them? And those technologies that exist just aren't going to do that in the timescale required that we've committed ourselves to.
Thank you. And to follow up on that, Andrew Boswell's been doing amazing work about cumulative impacts of carbon emissions. What are the risks if you've got multiple airports in terms of the planning process of tracking where all these carbon emissions are going?
Well, we don't have a view on whether they should all be happening. They're all going to happen in silos, as Celeste was saying earlier on. That each planning application goes ahead. The planning inspectorate doesn't have the power to say it doesn't want this to happen. And even in the case of Gatwick, where the planning inspectorate said this is going to fundamentally impact the UK's ability to meet its climate obligations, the Secretary of State has overruled it. So even where you've got the process in place, politics can trump that process, which that's the world we live in. But that makes it incredibly difficult to look at these things and say, well, it's okay, that one can happen and that one can't, because we actually haven't taken that view. We're not having that conversation. And so we're just effectively allowing a race to the who can get through quick enough before some point in the future maybe a government's going to have to say enough's enough. And we're not there at this point, but we're not doing the work yet to understand when that point should come.
Yeah, politics trumping science feels problematic. Celeste, if I can come to you. So you talked about... Sorry, did you want to say something before I ask you a question?
I was just going to say about cumulative emissions that
Please.
it was actually in the Gatwick discussion. Yeah. The planning inspectors had raised it, and the answer was that there was, I think it's the IEMA guidance, advises against it, and so it was raised and then dismissed. And as Paul said, the planning inspectorate said we still believe it shouldn't go ahead because it was going to be heading towards this, what we call this sort of significant 5% impact from one project on the total ability of the nation to meet its carbon budgets. But there's no other framework except for that, and it was rejected. So it's a political question.
Can I explore that a little bit more? So you talked, I think you used the phrase headroom before, and you were talking about air quality. But I think you can make the same argument around...
Christina.
Oh, sorry, Christina.
That was a good one. I noted it down.
Oh, if I can still put it to you, so this kind of idea of headroom with carbon emissions, presumably if we start to allow more carbon emissions with airports, what's the risk in terms of for other sectors, do you think?
Well, I mean, this is a complicated question. I mean, if you can imagine the carbon budgets are like a big bucket, you can keep pouring carbon in, and all that the Climate Change Act does is say, at a certain point, we need to make sure that it doesn't spill over. So what we have at the moment is every single sector and every single airport and everybody saying, yeah, but it's not my project that's going to be the one that tips it over. It's over there somewhere. They need to worry about it, not me. And as things stand, that is how these decisions are made. So you will hear this language, and you heard it in the Heathrow in 2018 when Heathrow, or 2017 when the first legal cases came out. You heard it with Gatwick. Our project is not significant. It doesn't reach this 5% threshold. The problem is that there isn't really a way currently in the whole system to look at one sector against the other sectors. So as Paul says, in the future, you may well end up with aviation consuming 25% of the budget, but none of us have had a discussion about whether we think that this activity is the one that we should protect at all costs. So it kind of gets into these questions of, we talk about residual emissions, and I think this is one of these areas where it's easy to claim, well, my sector's hard to decarbonise, therefore we will have residual emissions from our sector, and that is okay. But I think, as we approach this time where the carbon budgets will really start to bite in the next 25 years, I think we should have a discussion about what activity in the economy do we really think is the one that we need. So yeah, does that answer your question?
It does.
It's a bit of a philosophical point, but unfortunately there isn't anything in the planning scheme at the moment that actually allows a hard and fast answer on that.
It's philosophical, but with the wildfires and floods on their way, and here it feels like something we need to grasp quite quickly. Sustainable aviation fuel, SAF. What uncertainties exist around the scalability of SAF? So
lots of uncertainties. One is price. It will be, and it is more expensive than conventional fuels, and that will eventually have an impact on ticket prices. No one is quite sure. I mean, there's the debate going on at the moment on the revenue certainty mechanism bill going through Parliament. There's been a lot of very detailed modelling and discussions about the impact on price, but at the moment it's somewhere between 2 and 7 times more expensive than conventional fuel. The second uncertainty is the availability of feedstock. So at the moment, the SAF mandate, which was introduced at the beginning of this year, allows up to 2030, 100% of the fuel feedstock would be what's called HEFA, which is basically used cooking oil or used oils. At the moment, it looks like there is enough to meet the sort of 2% requirement. I mean, I'm not quite sure, we haven't had all the full figures, but we're hovering somewhere between 1 and 2% on that at the moment. But towards 2050, because the used cooking oil is not seen as a scalable feedstock, the other kinds of fuels are meant to come in to sort of tip the balance. So that would be things like waste, fuels from waste, so what's known as second generation fuels. Unfortunately, there's hardly any plants of that nature being built at the moment. There's a lot of discussion on the revenue certainty mechanism to try and get the investment there. Again, you said you should maybe speak to the airlines, you should speak to the fuel producers as well, because, the investment's not happening, and the investment's not happening for a reason, and part of that is a scarcity of feedstock. And then there are genuine concerns about sustainability. So I'll come to what's known as the third generation of fuels, which are known as e-fuels, which basically take captured CO2 and renewable electricity and green hydrogen and put them together in a complicated chemical process, which I can't explain, and that creates a synthetic fuel. But again, I talk about these discussions about where do we want these scarce resources to go. It's a sort of economic question in a way. But, at the moment, the green hydrogen, there's a tiny fraction of what we need being produced. Do we want that green hydrogen to go to agriculture, to decarbonise fertiliser? Do we want it to go to road transport? Do we want to go to aviation? Do we want it to go into home heating? And I found out the other day that apparently one of the ideas for finalising the green power plan, so the sort of bit at the end where we can't have the renewables running the sun and the wind all the time, there's going to be sort of, I don't know what the gap is, but there will be a gap of we need some kind of extra fuel or some way to generate electricity beyond that. I understand that's also looking at green hydrogen. So, the problem with e-fuels is what if that green hydrogen goes somewhere else? And then you take basically captured carbon, which you could store underground, you take a green hydrogen, which you could use somewhere else, you put them together and you lose 50% of the energy in that process. And then you put it in a plane, you put it in the sky, you burn it, and it's released back into the atmosphere. So, there's genuine sustainability questions, genuine price impact questions, and feedstock availabilities. They're the 3 big concerns.
There's really interesting work by Howard Jacobson that says we can go to renewables on 100%, and actually we don't need green hydrogen, but that's a separate conversation.
But my point is more, why would one sector be able to dominate that debate and say it should all come to us? And we haven't had that debate as a society.
And just on that finally, so the government is still subsidising jet fuel, kerosene. Where is the conversation about whether that's the right priority?
We're constantly raising, and we have constantly raised for as long as we've existed, the lack of tax on aviation fuel. It's just an injustice that, somebody driving their car pays more tax on their fuel than any airlines ever paid on their fuel. We were pleased that the Chancellor took the initiative to increase the APD on private jets, but obviously that's a tiny drop in the ocean. But yeah, it's just, you know, it is baffling that we now have this sector that doesn't pay any tax or VAT. You know, and I think I just, you know, I tend to try to say that wherever I go because I think often people don't realise.
Totally, it's very well put. Christina, if I can move on to you. So we've talked about the UK and their net zero goal, but obviously London has its own net zero goal of 2030. Is aviation expansion compatible with the Mayor's pathway?
Sorry. I mean, it's a very difficult, again, to see how it could be compatible with that pathway. And the work what we've done so far has been kind of looking at a kind of incremental expansion. But the way we've been looking at, if everything else decarbonised in line with the pathway and aviation emissions stayed as they are now, we'd end up being about 5% above target. And that's if they stay as they are now. Yep. So if you saw those emissions increasing, it's going to be very difficult to see how you can kind of reconcile that with those that ambition and that pathway. But I mean, again, we'll need to see more about what the actual detail of the proposals are in order to understand exactly what that impact would be, but at a high level.
Thank you. Am I right in thinking that in the pandemic, obviously, flights massively reduced for obvious reasons, and then the implication was that they would never come back to pre-pandemic levels? But actually, what's happening is they're back on the trajectory again.
I think they're back up above where they were before.
Right.
Yeah.
And what work are you doing to look at what level of flights would be acceptable in terms of being able to keep on that pathway regarding the fact that it's increasing since pre-pandemic levels?
So again, I think it probably goes back to some of what Celeste was just talking about. There's lots of things that can change. There will be new generation of aircraft. There will be different fuel types. There will be different ways that people can try and, or airlines or airports can try and kind of limit the emissions of their operations, whether that's, you know, using zero emission transport within the airport site, you know. So it's trying to understand exactly what those future proposals will look like to see what the full emissions impact of them are. So I think we need that extra layer of detail for us to be able to properly assess that. But essentially, as things stand, an increase in aviation emissions is just going to increase emissions in London, and that's going to be very hard to reconcile with that pathway.
Thank you. Finally, if the expansion is incompatible with our climate targets, what legal implications does that have?
So again, I think that's where it comes back to, you know, what's the Mayor's role in this? So the Mayor does have environmental duties and obviously was involved with legal challenges last time around. So I think, I'm sorry to be very boring about it, but we're going to have to wait and see what the proposals actually are so that we can understand what the impacts are and then kind of review what needs to happen from there.
I suspected that might be the answer, and it's fair enough. Thank you. Tracy, finally, just to see what's your experience with this, and how do you think we can make sure, is it possible for it to be compatible?
As an organisation, we don't take a view on the whole economy transition path, as you might expect, but to sort of overlay a couple of community perspectives, there are certainly members of the communities around Heathrow that I talk to that are very pro the growth impact of Heathrow, as you would expect, but there are also those who are deeply concerned about some of the climate impacts. But to make it very local, the whole economy pathway, it has so much uncertainty in the transition on the aviation sector that's just been set out by panellists along here. And it's essentially a sense that the government might at some point need to put the brakes on the growth. Set that against the potential certainty that those 700 or so households face of destruction of their properties to make space for the third runway. I've certainly heard local residents questioning, how can we trust the surety and the certainty of the decision that government has to make, because there's so much uncertainty both around the growth impacts and around the climate impacts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all.
The other dimension I think to bring out is adaptation is going to be really important to take account of as well. In the noise context, mitigations are going to involve glazing and all manner of things.
We're coming to noise in a minute.
Okay, I'll put down the marker. You know, if Heathrow or Aurora are going to put in lots of double glazing, triple glazing, best standards, but that prevents houses being well ventilated, then that's going to throw up issues as well. So that whole sort of picture needs to come together.
Thank you very much. Thanks all, and thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Just so that you know, we're going to ask you some questions specifically about air quality next. Then we're going to talk about noise and airspace modernisation. And then we're also going to ask some questions about community involvement and consultation, just so you know where we're going to go to next, so that hopefully we won't answer the questions before the Assembly member who's agreed to ask it has actually asked it, because we do that sometimes. I'm just going to bring in Assembly member Mahfouz, who's going to briefly ask something now before we move on.
Yes, just to stick with the same topic of carbon impact and net zero. So one of the measures that Stansted is taking is to provide all of the electricity by, I think, 2038 within the terminal, providing its own solar panels on farmland near to the airport. Clearly, that isn't an option at Heathrow, given the constraints around a very busy part of the capital city. But are you aware of any movements within the current proposals as to how they would significantly reduce their carbon emissions in terms of electricity provision for the terminals at the current site?
I can have a go, but I think Heathrow will be better placed to answer that. I think they've spent a lot of time and money trying to decarbonise their on-site emissions. I think they've got ground source heat pumps and electric vehicles and these sort of things, so they're doing the bit on that side. But the big chunk of the emissions, like 96% of them, are from the aircraft. So you can make that as 100%, net zero as you like. The big problem is the aircraft, and that's not going to be solved anytime soon.
Yeah, the last time we looked into this, which I think was 2019, we also went on a visit to Heathrow, and you're quite right, ground source heat pumps, electric vehicles, but Heathrow will be with us after you, so we will ask them further questions in that space to see if things have moved on that 4% of their emissions. I'm going to move on to Assembly Member Small Edwards, who represents Central London, West Central. And he's going to start the questions on air quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to all of you. I think maybe we'll start with Celeste, if that's OK. How would you expect the impacts of an expanded Heathrow Airport to affect the air quality in the local area first, and then more broadly across London?
So I think we can expect they'll be quite big, and this was one of the reasons previously that Heathrow had struggled to get its expansion plans approved. Was always on the impact of air pollution. Part of that is to do with cars arriving at the airport, and so a lot of work went into previous plans to ensure that people came to the airport on trains, or that the parking was restricted so that you could reduce the NO2, which was basically coming from the cars. So I think things are a bit different today because we've had such great work done across all of London. Things like the ULEZ, which the Mayor brought in, has made a huge impact on air quality, and nitrogen dioxide levels are now much lower than they were. And I think even last month, plenty of places in London which had never been under the legal limit of 40 micrograms per square metre of air were then compliant. So that's fantastic. And as Christina said, we can't undermine that. But it will be different this time because so many more cars are now electric vehicles. So what I really think everybody needs to be aware of is the pollution from the actual planes. And this has been obviously quite difficult to measure because if you've got planes flying over London depositing particles, it's very difficult to know how many of them stay in the atmosphere and how many of them fall to the ground. When they fall to the ground flying over central London, any of your constituencies, how do you know that that's actually from an aircraft and it's not from cars or a local pollution source? So there's a lot of work still to be done in the scientific community on that, and particularly on, I mentioned earlier, ultrafine particles. So at the moment, there is no World Health Organization guidelines on UFPs. I think there's some work going on in Europe on that at the moment, but there's nothing, so there's no sort of fixed exposure level that you have for things like particulate matter 2.5 and particulate matter 5 and 10 and nitrogen dioxide. So I think that I cannot see how you can go ahead without really trying to understand the impact of the pollution that comes from the actual planes. I do know that there was some work done by Gary Fuller at Imperial College outside Gatwick Airport during the consultation on the Gatwick plans, and he had set up his own air pollution monitoring, and they found concentrations of ultrafine particles 500 metres away from the airport boundaries that were the same concentration as something found 5 metres from the side of a road in central London. And that had to be from the plains because Gatwick's in the countryside and it's easier to monitor. That's part of the problem with Heathrow is this mixing of all kinds of construction, road emissions and factories and chemical works. But Gatwick is easier to do because it's rural. So yeah, we've been talking to Gary to try and improve the scientific knowledge on that. But, you know, there are other things that the planes are emitting at high altitudes, sulfur dioxide, soot, lubrication oil comes out the back of planes. These things cause contrails, which are the white lines you see forming behind the planes in the sky. They have a warming and climate impact as well because they trap heat. They turn into big cirrus clouds and they trap heat. So yeah, there's all kinds of stuff going on. There's an interaction. I mean, I'm really just getting the science. It's beyond what I can deal with. But when some of that happens at high altitudes, it causes ozone formation, and that can impact climate warming in the stratosphere. But it can also happen at ground level and cause ozone pollution. And again, there's not enough information anywhere about localized ozone formation, but we know that it's not good and it's very dangerous. So again, I think there's more work to be done from the scientific community, but these things need to be factored into any DCO, which would be the consent order, development consent order application, would need to really get into this stuff.
Thank you very much for that really comprehensive answer. Does anyone have anything else to add on that question?
I'll just add a little bit without getting too deeply into the surface access, but I think we really do need to think about how such expansion is going to get people to and from the airport, because the emissions associated with that travel will be really, really important. And I think there's a lot of focus on the increased passenger capacity, but that will also mean that there'll be huge numbers of staff, there'll be additional freight trips. So making sure that actually that how people can travel sustainably to the airport as part of expansion plans right from the outset is going to be really, really important. And I think, as Celeste said, you know, we just had the amazing news that London is now legally compliant for the first time, but that is not a situation that is sort of banked. You can easily go back the other way, so we need to be really careful that we don't undo the progress that we've made.
And just on that, what do you think Heathrow or potentially TfL can do to promote people to travel to Heathrow by public transport?
So this is straying into probably Transport Committee areas, but what we need to do is have real investment in the capacity that we need on public transport networks. And actually, if what we see is lots of those trips being catered for by car, that's going to slow down those bus journey times, that's going to make the buses even less attractive, and it all becomes quite sort of self-fulfilling. So we need to make sure that we've got really understand what capacity is needed on public transport networks and make sure that that is funded and provided as part of expansion.
Thank you. And just to come back to the point that was made about ultrafine particles, is enough understood about the air quality and health impacts of aircraft emissions? And I'm guessing you're going to say probably not, given your earlier answer. And do you think ultrafine particles need to be regulated more closely?
I'm not a scientist, but I'm speaking to real eminent authorities on the topic, which would be people like Gary Fuller, who's been writing great stuff about air pollution for a long time. He's absolutely of the opinion that UFPs will need to be and will be regulated in the not too distant future. I said it's being looked at the European level. So I think it's one of those, you know, I was reflecting on the sort of history of how nitrogen dioxide, or NO2, the limits, and how that's kind of changed over the years. The scientific endeavour to understand these things goes hand in hand with the political will to do something about it. And, you know, it's generally accepted now that the 40 microgram limit that we have in the UK is actually not good enough. The EU currently has a 20 microgram limit, and the WHO recommends 10 micrograms. So although we are legally compliant, that's actually kind of an old target, which probably needs to evolve. So, yeah, I think that we need to pay serious attention to this, because if you talked about nitrogen dioxide or PM2.5 10, 15 years ago, people wouldn't have really understood the dangers, and it's only now that we've really started to triangulate the data about the impacts and the health impacts that we've really started to realise how bad this all is. I mean, yes, there is a lot of work done about what comes out of the back of a plane, but the complicating factor, as I'm sure you can imagine, is that they're flying at high altitudes for most of the time, and the engine performs differently according to where it is. So obviously when it's taking off, when it's landing, different things are coming out at different times. And those things behave differently in different parts of the atmosphere. Now, you would wonder, wouldn't we have thought about this before we started putting planes in the sky? But, you know, we all know the history of chemical pollution. We just plunk this stuff into our environment, and it takes us a long time to wonder what's happened. But, there's lots and lots of work that looks at, it's all done at the international level at ICAO, which is the UN body which deals with aviation. They do a lot on ozone formation and sulfur dioxide and nitrogen. But there is a gap in people's knowledge in terms of what happens at the ground level from the planes as they're coming down to land, and how you, certainly with Heathrow, how you disentangle that from what's happening elsewhere around the airport and say this piece of particulate matter that I found came from a plane. You know, you can do that, but obviously it's very difficult to do. So I think it's just a question of making sure that the science evolves and that the science is well communicated and people understand the dangers.
This is an issue that comes up regularly amongst the Keisha membership as well in terms of attending our forum. Many of the local authorities feel strongly that this should be incorporated in frameworks. I think the good news is that the Planning Inspectorate has just said that in its scoping document for the DCO process that Heathrow will need to set out its latest understanding of the science. But it feels as if there's also an opportunity for the Department for Transport to, just as it puts in air quality standards and expectations into the airport's national policy statement, to think about how to handle the uncertainties around UFPs and what should be written into the airport's national policy statement as well, because that's essentially the standard that Heathrow will be held to.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I mean, we've previously heard a lot of evidence, including from Gary Fuller, about the impact on lung health, but also on brain health. And I think the more investigation that there's been made into the ultrafine particles, the particulate matter, which maybe 10 years ago, or even certainly 20 years ago, we didn't have as much knowledge, but instruments have improved and we're much more able to detect the impact on, living bodies of these particles, leave alone the noise impacts or indeed the climate impacts. The health impacts from the particles can be, as we now know, it can cross the blood-brain barrier and all sorts of things. So, yeah, it's. I think there is more that will be seen in this area. However, I'm going to come to Assemblymember Mahfouz, who just wanted to come in. Are you okay? Okay. So in which case I'm not, but I am going to move on to. We're going to move on to the questions on noise and airspace modernisation from Assemblymember Roberts. And I'll just mention to Assembly members and also guests that we are now starting to run slightly behind. So snappy questions and answers would be good.
Thank you, Chair. With specific reference to noise, which communities do you expect to be most affected by the proposed new runway at Heathrow?
The whole of London, if you look at the airspace change proposal that Heathrow have got on the CAA portal at the moment, so literally the whole of London is going to be impacted by these changes. Those closest to the runways, or new runway, will be most severely impacted in terms of noise, because they're going to be right at the end where the engines are using full throttle. But the potential for new flight paths means you're spreading that noise pollution into new communities potentially, and also linked to the airspace modernisation. If you have more concentration of flight paths, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to get a greater intensity and frequency down specific flight paths. And for those people on final approach paths, so big chunks of your constituency and Hounslow and Chiswick coming down the Thames there, 6-7 nautical miles, I think is the final approach path. For safety reasons, the aircraft have to be on those paths, and that's either side of the airport. So that those communities under there are going to get hammered. There's no other way of looking at it.
Okay, thank you. Good. That's all, Chair. I'm conscious of time.
Bring back Concorde. That's what nobody says, because it was even noisier than anything that goes on at the moment. Assemblymember Mahfouz, did you want to pop in there as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess is there in your mind a number of a figure of the number of people who are currently impacted by Heathrow and the number that will increase to if the proposals that are on the table go ahead?
It depends how you measure it, what particular noise contour or noise metric you use to measure. But if you take the 57 LAEQ metric, which is what is in the Airport's National Policy Statement, you're looking at around 700,000 people impacted currently by operations at Heathrow. When this was looked at by Parliament previously, the estimate was around another 430-odd thousand that would be impacted within that noise contour. However, in noise policy, what's called the lowest observable adverse effect level, so where health impact levels begin to be noticeable, it is 51 decibels, so quite a lot lower, and that could push that up to by another 400,000, maybe another maybe up to a total of 1.5, maybe 2 million people, depending on where the contour grows. So, but I think it's really important to understand that these are noise contours that measure the average noise over a period of time, and what's really disturbing for communities is the number of flights, the frequency of those flights, and even with over time those contours have shrunk on average, but the noise and the number and the frequency is only going to go up, especially if you expand. So the number is going to increase, and there's a real big challenge both to understand in health terms what happens when you change somebody's noise environment, because suddenly all of a sudden people may be used to the level of overflight they've got, and it changes, and then they become acutely aware. That has a huge health impact, which we're only just really beginning to understand the implications of.
And one of the things that Labour set out before the election last time around was obviously 4 tests that Heathrow had to meet as part of their set of proposals. They've had a number of months to work on that to show how they achieve those 4 tests as part of their new set of proposals. I was looking through those their papers that they submitted on the 31st of July to look for that in terms of how they are mitigating noise, air impact and so on. Perhaps, Tracy, to start off with, you're independently looking at this. What's your assessment as to whether Heathrow's current plans, as they stand, meet those 4 tests that have been set out by the Labour government?
Well, I'm not sure I've seen anything that by the Department for Transport or the government that has specified the measurement of those tests, and I would expect that the dialogue that's going on between promoters and the Department for Transport at the moment would be trying to reconcile those two things, but there's nothing that I've seen or scrutinised that allows me to offer a view one way or the other at the moment, but we'll be very interested as and when that clarity on the full test comes.
I'll just add to that because I don't have to be quite as diplomatic, but I'm not sure. I think they were a political device, and I'm not sure, again, there's no measurement framework. We know it just says minimise noise impacts. What does that mean? By how much, for whom, by how many people? There's a whole different range of understanding that. So as an organisation, we'll be trying to feed into the department, here's what we think such assessment should look like, and hopefully that's then reflected into the updated Airport's National Policy Statement, which was, for want of a better word, slightly woolly in its language around what the scheme promoter was obliged to do. And that's problematic because it creates a lack of certainty for overflowing communities and allows a bit too much wiggle room for promoters to do what they like.
I might just add in on the carbon emissions, because again, we don't know exactly what the rules are on the carbon emissions. But I think you can infer from what happened in the Gatwick decision how it will go, which is basically the AMPS, as it currently is written, says that the scheme should not have a material impact on the government's ability to meet its carbon budgets. And if you go back to what I said previously, it's a bucket. So, you know, each promoter will say, my contribution to the bucket is not the one. And there's this kind of arbitrary figure of a 5% impact, which I'm sure Heathrow will be telling you later, but I'm sure that they will do their hardest piece of work to show that it won't meet that 5% threshold. But what then happens is that the planning inspectors put that against what's known as the Jet Zero strategy, which is the government's plan for decarbonising aviation. And they assume that Jet Zero all works. And it's the high ambition Jet Zero as well. It's not even the central scenario. They just assume that those things work. You know, we could go into the detail of how they're not working, but they're not working yet. And then basically the planning inspector will say, well, we still think that this scheme will have a huge impact on carbon budgets. But as we saw with Gatwick, then the Secretary of State says, yes, I've noticed that, but I think the economic case overrides that, and it's gone. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time trying to answer this question because we got asked this at the Environmental Audit Committee as well. There really isn't an answer other than this trying to drill down to this political semantics about what does material impact mean. And everybody's trying to do their hardest from our side to prove that it will be a material impact, and from the other side to prove that it won't be. And, you know, it's really disappointing that there isn't a proper answer to it.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to Assemblymember Polanski, who's going to ask you some questions about concentrated flight paths and that sort of area.
Celeste, so the committee had previously heard about the difficulties of concentrated flight paths, particularly the kind of, if everything's spread out, then everyone's annoyed about it, but if you kind of stack planes, then it's a small group of people who are really being plagued with it. How will the proposed additional runway and associated flights affect concentrated flight paths?
It's difficult to answer because, as Paul said, we've got not only the plans to expand the airport, which will influence everything anyway, but we've also got each airport currently submitting its plans to CAA for its flight path for the airspace modernisation. And each of, I believe how it's done is Heathrow goes first and they work out Heathrow and then they do the other ones around Heathrow. But obviously if that then turns into Heathrow expansion, then that's going to lead to another delay while everybody works out what will that look like. I mean, from AEF's perspective, we don't take a view on concentration versus dispersal because it's very different in different places. So, for example, if you've got an airport in a largely rural constituency, you can disperse the flights because there's not anyone living there. Obviously, if you are under the Heathrow flight path and it gets further concentrated, then it literally will be a plane going over the top of your house every minute. So I think, we've tried to be agnostic about and understand the local realities of that, but I think you probably have an answer on it as well.
Please, Paul.
Historically, we've always supported dispersal because people living in London get the benefit of Heathrow existing where it does, but the disbenefit of the noise isn't equitably shared. And whilst that probably makes us popular in some areas because we'd be newly exposing people, that feels like a more just position. And concentrated flight paths, these exist already. This is not a new phenomenon, but you're just going to get maybe a greater propensity of it. It does allow that to happen. Where we've got concern, and I mentioned respite earlier as well, is that you potentially get multiple flight paths that could be concentrated, and that does give, in theory, the ability for the airport or NATS, the air traffic service, to switch between different flight paths. So in theory, you might be able to protect that respite for certain communities. The problem is that not all of the aircraft in the fleet mix coming into Heathrow will be capable of doing that. They might not be capable of doing it in the same time frame. So there's a concern that the potential benefit there doesn't quite materialise in the same pace as the increase in capacity, and then all of a sudden you're just getting people hammered. The other issue, of course, is noise doesn't fall down in like a straight line from these flight paths. It comes out in a cone. So can you create sufficient distance between different concentrated flight paths to actually create what they call meaningful respite, which is meant to be a contrast to sort of 9 decibels between the paths, and that's not. It's not proven to be possible. Where concentrated flight paths seem to work really well globally is places like Sydney and Melbourne, where you can route the aircraft over the sea instead of over people's houses. And London is the most densely populated city in the country, and wherever you bring the aircraft in, they are going to fly over people. So there's a real challenge on how you manage that going forwards.
Thank you. And Christina, can I ask you, what compensations or mitigations would you like to see for residents based on the proposed new flight path changes?
So this is probably straying slightly outside of my remit, to be honest, but I think the real important thing for us is understanding that the noise impact on Londoners is very real. And I think that, that as you've described, you can either have fewer people experiencing more noise or more people experiencing more dispersed noise. And I think what's really important throughout this is that the voices of Londoners are heard. So I think it's making sure that we do have the real kind of proper engagement with those communities to understand what the impacts are and what their views are on it.
Are you satisfied at the moment that Londoners are being heard?
Well, I think we've got a lot more to run on this. So I think particularly on a new AMPS, we'll want to make sure that there's an opportunity for people to really engage with that process, as well as with specific airport expansion plans as well. So I think that's something that we'll definitely need to see more of.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you for picking up the pace as you did. I'd like to move on to Assemblymember Turrell, who's going to ask about community consultation and airspace modernisation.
Thank you very much, Chair. So this one is to Tracy, which is how does your organisation work to engage with people impacted by Heathrow Airport and resolve the issues that affect them? And are there any examples you have where you've been able to change as a result?
Thank you. Well, we work in close partnership with 6 forums, looking at all issues ranging from transport to TfL, as you represented, the Noise and Airspace Community Forum, we have a local community forum, a passenger forum, a local growth forum, and an air quality forum. The community forums bring together representatives of local communities. The footprint at the moment seems to be quite proximate to Heathrow, and so as I look ahead to the challenges ahead, I do think the noise footprint is bigger than we currently capture at the moment, and I think it's going to be very important that we work once the scheme promoter is known about how we are going to develop that. I also have aspirations to not just be reliant on the people who give up the very good people who give up time to come along to forums, but to actually be reaching out and getting proper data more widely within the community. So I think that will be important. I've been in post just coming up to a year. One of the most striking examples I've seen of the difference that community engagement makes at the moment has been around nuisance parking problems, where unlicensed taxi operators can cause huge problems for local residents. And Heathrow have responded to work closely with local authorities and others to put in sort of essentially dispersal orders that is making a difference, but there's a continual need to push forward. So we can make a difference, but the issues are becoming bigger and more strategic. And so my ambition for the airport's national policy statement stage would be that we are helping local communities understand what's been put out in front of them. We know from our air quality work that people don't necessarily understand the health impacts. Therefore, they don't know that it's worth them responding. So making it real to people, I think, is going to be very important. I'm conscious of time, but I must say that I think the process around noise impacts at the moment is extremely difficult. So we can help people plug into the airport's national policy statement. We can bring views towards the DCO stage, and we can work to ensure that community views can be adequately reflected in the consultation around airspace. But at no point in that process is it really clear to local residents what it means for them. And so I do think there's a challenge for the Department for Transport to try and bring these processes together. The airspace change can culminate with a Secretary of State decision. The DCO process certainly does, and so we will certainly be encouraging the Department of Transport to try and make sure that it's clear what the impacts are going to be so that people can express their views.
Thank you for that. Throwing this out to the whole panel, Nana, which is what process of community engagement should be undertaken around a new runway, and how best can those affected be involved? Should we start with Paul and work down the table?
Well, it's important to recognise there's sort of statutory obligations on scheme promoters in terms of public consultation, both on the expansion and any associated airspace change. So that's a start. If we go back a few years, Heathrow did a lot of work in engaging whole swathes of London around expansion and airspace change. So the public consultation forums, I think I probably spoke on some panels with them, and I believe some of your colleagues on the Assembly were partaking as well. So there's this, but the big challenge for both of these things is how do you engage people who don't think it's going to impact them, but they may be, because you don't want the scenario in 5-10 years where they wake up and all of a sudden they're under a flight path or didn't realise the third runway was coming because they haven't been paying attention to the news or whatever. And that's a challenge for Heathrow, but as much for organisations like HACAN. We've got members across London, as far away as Reading to the west and Woolwich to the southeast. So how do we get those people engaged, and how do we make sure that they're informed? And as Tracy was alluding to, these issues are really complex and technical. So how do we and how does the scheme promoter break that down into language and opportunities that people can understand? And we're at risk of consultation fatigue already, and we're only at the start of the process. So there's a whole range just in the rest of this calendar year where people are going to have opportunities to engage before we even get into that formal statutory process. So how much is too much, but also how do you reach those people that aren't on social media or aren't looking at local newspapers? There's a real challenge there in making sure as many people as possible have a chance to participate.
Yeah, I haven't got a lot to add. I mean, it's true that often people don't realise about aircraft until they fly over their house. I think that's just a truism, is if you're not directly underneath or under the cone, as Paul said, you can somehow tune them out in London. So I think that is a danger. AEF has been doing quite a lot of work with the CAA about the design of the community consultation and the airspace modernisation plan. We do have concerns that the body that's been set up there won't have any decision-making power. It will just have a sort of... it's still just a proposal, so we're not sure on the details. But yeah, we haven't seen the details yet of what would happen with the Heathrow one, but certainly the way that airspace modernisation is being planned at the moment, we are quite worried that communities won't have a proper voting voice in this.
Yeah, I think the point I would make would just be about the importance of that ongoing engagement. So there will obviously be kind of formal consultation opportunities, but it's about making sure that actually the voices of the most impacted communities are kind of consistently engaged throughout, rather than just leaving it to those kind of big set pieces.
Thank you. There's a lot, I think everything I agree with in terms of what's just been said. We think that the approach to engagement has to start with information. Actually, we would challenge both promoters to be more open and forthcoming with the information that's provided. There's a real need to make sure that there's accessible information for residents, but enough detail for local authorities to fulfil their statutory roles, and it's hard to do that, but I think it's going to be critical. On the engagement itself, points have got to be relevant. They've got to make a difference to people's lives. People that need to understand why they're being asked to contribute. There's huge challenges around accessibility and learnings from last time. My predecessor body has got extensive set of reports in terms of some of the learnings, and we're talking to Heathrow and others about those. And the reach is really important. We've talked about the noise footprint, and I think we need to get bigger and better around reaching that footprint. But a lot of the discussions around, for example, the zone where people may lose their homes have been very focused on the needs of property owners. Well, there's private renters, there's people in social housing as well. We know that there are groups that are hard to reach, and I'm looking forward to Heathrow sharing the data that they have on how representative responses to consultation were last time, so that we can work with them to say, well, actually, here are the groups where we need to work harder and to devise strategies to make sure that people are able to respond. The final issue, I think, is really important. People need to feel that what they say can make a difference, that they're not just whistling into the wind, as it were. There's long-standing issues about community trust with Heathrow Airport that are long documented and definitely precede me. I think to start to address those, to make the consultation real, we've got to be clear about which issues can be influenced, which are really up for grabs, so that people feel that their views can make a difference.
Thank you. And Christine, this last one is just for you. And yeah, if you feel it's better to write with us as the answer to that, please feel free to make use of that. So how are the Mayor and TfL engaging with the government and other stakeholders around this process?
Yeah, so there's a lot of engagement going on now, which is really good and really positive. So both with us and with GLA colleagues as well. So we're meeting with Civil Aviation Authority, with Heathrow Airport Limited. So those kind of, that engagement is there at office level, and with DfT as well. So yeah, that's happening.
Thank you very much to our guests for answering all of our questions. Sorry to hustle you slightly towards the end. If there's anything that you feel that you didn't answer fully, we're very happy, as Assemblymember Tara was just indicated, to take additional points in writing. We're going to draw this panel to a close, which means I'm going to bang the gavel, and we're then going to prepare for the next panel, which includes, and in fact is, Heathrow Airport, talking about the proposals. So I'm going to adjourn for about 2 minutes. Welcome back to today's meeting of the London Assembly Environment Committee. I would now like to welcome our guests for our second panel discussion, and I believe they may have actually been able to listen to our first panel. And in the chamber we now have from Heathrow Airport Becky Coffin, who is the Director for Communities and Sustainability, Heathrow Airport Limited, and also Matt Gorman, who is the Director of Carbon Strategy, Heathrow Airport Limited. And Matt, this is definitely not your first rodeo in front of the Environment Committee. You're very welcome here again. We're going to start with a quick question from me, and then we will go out to the other Assembly members on the committee. The first question is, how did this set of proposals differ from those previously developed and that have been consulted on before? Thank you. Matt and then Becky. Yes, please, if you don't mind.
Good, done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So we were invited at the start of this year by the government to submit updated proposals in July. So we spent the first part of the year reviewing the plans that we'd obviously developed extensively before 2020 when the project was paused, testing that whether any changes in the business or technology meant that we'd look at things differently. But actually the proposals that we submitted are very similar to the ones that we put forward in the run-up to 2020. So in summary, a northwest runway, a full-length northwest runway of 3.5 kilometres. The significance of full length meaning it can operate every aircraft type operating at Heathrow, which is very significant to provide hub capacity, to be able to alternate between runways and provide breaks from noise, additional terminal capacity at the west of the airport, a new building next to Terminal 5 and a satellite link to that, and surface access links. I'm very happy to explain those in more detail.
So it wasn't just when I looked at the plans and thought these look rather familiar that I was having a sense of Groundhog Day. They are actually fairly similar, is what you're saying.
Yes, and tested through the beginning of this year, as I say. Yeah.
OK. Becky, did you want to add anything to the points that Matt has just made about how different the proposal is?
No, nothing to add, thank you.
Thank you. So the second question that I would like to put to you before we move on to others is, are you, as Heathrow Airport, in conversation with the groups behind any of the alternative proposals, such as Aurora or any of the other groups that may or may not still be putting forward their proposals? And I'll start with Becky this time and then move to Matt.
No, I'm not in conversation on behalf of Heathrow with any of those groups. We were aware that last week we were invited, as we are every quarter, to attend the Kisha Council, so where our local stakeholders, as convened by Kisha, have the opportunity to ask Heathrow management questions about our operations and development plans. And we're aware that Aurora attended that same group before we did, but we were not in the room at the same time.
Matt, anything to add to that? Any conversation with any of the mysterious 5 groups that we're not allowed to see their proposals, or Aurora?
No, we haven't. And it's worth saying that over the last 6 months, in addition to carbon roles, I've also been programme lead for our expansion plans, so the proposals we've submitted to the government. So can say confidently that we haven't had any engagement. It's obviously been a government-run process to invite proposals. So, as you've stated, I think we are aware that 7 were submitted. We know that one of the other ones was the Aurora scheme for the reasons that Becky's outlined, but no engagement.
We thought probably not, but we thought it was worth asking just to see if any of them had spoken to the people who are currently quite involved in Heathrow Airport. Moving on, I'm going to bring in Assemblymember Polanski first.
Thank you both. How will the expansion plan be delivered and aligned with the UK's 2050 climate target?
Very happy to answer that question. It's something we take very seriously, something I've taken personally very seriously for many years, and I'm very passionate about finding solutions to. I mean, let me say up front, we're going to have to find a solution to be able to grow and do that in line with net zero and the UK's carbon budgets, for the reason that the airport's national policy statement sets a clear requirement for us to do that. The UK aviation sector through a body called Sustainable Aviation, which brings together airports, airlines, manufacturers in the UK, was the first aviation sector globally to make a commitment to net zero and publish a plan to get there nearly 6 years ago now, at the beginning of 2020. There are 4 main elements to the plan, and I'll cover those briefly, and you may well want to explore further in questions. What I would say is that since we published that plan, there have been a host of plans published by other industry bodies around the world, governments, academics, and they all have the same core elements to the plan. More efficient aircraft, lower carbon, sustainable aviation fuels, zero carbon, hydrogen emission, hydrogen-powered flights, and greenhouse gas removals. So the very quick landscape of that, of those tools in the toolkit, the more efficient aircraft, as aircraft get lighter and engines get cleaner, the new generation of aircraft replacing older generations are typically 20 to 25% more efficient. In addition, as your last panel heard, modernising airspace helps improve efficiency in the system. So everything efficiency related. If you think of a journey to net zero starting at 100 and getting to zero, that's about 25% of the journey. About 40%, the single biggest measure, is low carbon sustainable fuels. So technologically proven, being used widely around the world, but in small quantities. So the challenge is scaling them up. They're proven, but we need the right policy framework, mandates and floor prices in the UK to help stimulate development. I'm very happy to explore that further. And it's worth saying, in almost every other transition plan published globally for aviation, SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, features as the single biggest measure. Zero-emission hydrogen technology, exciting. Probably further out from a Heathrow perspective, so we'll probably start with smaller aircraft on shorter distances, so less of the Heathrow mix of aircraft. But potentially by the late 2040s, we'll see some aircraft serving smaller and shorter Heathrow routes using hydrogen. And then greenhouse gas removals for residual emissions. Plus, and again, very happy to explore this in questions, so 25% efficiency, 40% SAF. I think in our original roadmap, about a 10% allowance for hydrogen. And then of the remaining 25%, it was a split between greenhouse gas removals and slightly slower demand growth as a result of carbon pricing.
So 40% SAF, but we don't have that technology at the scale that you're talking about. So this is magical thinking, no?
Not magical thinking at all, but we've got to scale it at speed. So not magical in the sense that it's powered hundreds of thousands of flights. And just to give you an example from Heathrow, so 17% of the SAF produced globally was used at Heathrow last year, around 2.5% of our fuel. And that's as a result of the landing charge incentive that we introduced, so raising charges for every airline operating at Heathrow to create a pot that airlines can bid for. And that's to help tackle the challenge that SAF costs more than kerosene, so it helps close the price gap and encourage uptake. So we know that if you get the price signals right, you can start to attract SAF. It is absolutely, it's produced in small quantities now. So the challenge is, it's a classic, the cost of SAF is a classic market failure, so we need government intervention. The two key policies that we as a sector have been calling for and working with government on are a mandate, a requirement for fuel producers to produce, which came in at the beginning of this year in the UK. And as one of your previous panellists said, what's called a revenue certainty mechanism, effectively a floor price to de-risk early investment, similar to what we've used in renewable energy, which is actually completed its passage through the House of Commons yesterday, which will help de-risk investment in early plants in the UK, so where there are a number of plans, but they're looking for that policy support.
Doesn't this all presume, though, that you as a private business, your profit margin is more important than reducing the emissions? Because otherwise you'd say the technology doesn't exist, let's make sure we scale it up and then we'll expand. But to be expanding at the same time the technology doesn't exist feels like a monumental risk.
No, so I don't think profit's absolutely not more important than emissions. So what we've always said is that there doesn't need to be, and there shouldn't be, a choice between the benefits of aviation growth, which go much broader than our profits as an individual company, and later questions may well explore the role of Heathrow as a hub, but just to leave two stats with you, the fact that because we're a hub, you can reach 92% of the world's GDP on a single direct flight from Heathrow. and secondly, the fact that we're the UK's biggest port by value, with £200 billion worth nearly of goods exported in the cargo holds of aircraft. So it's, but those benefits need to go hand in hand with decarbonisation. I think we absolutely recognise the risks of climate change, both physical and transition risks to us as a sector. And we've been clear that in order for us to grow, we need to put forward a comprehensive plan to decarbonise. That will have to be examined through the planning process and ultimately approved by the government. But there's no world in which aviation thrives unless we are also on a path to decarbonise.
I'll go one more time because otherwise the chair will interrupt me. But you're saying that the benefits of aviation need to go hand in hand with decarbonisation. But that's precisely not what you're doing, because what I'm hearing is about the benefits of economic growth for aviation, but I'm also hearing that there isn't a plan to decarbonise. That plan does not exist. That plan is based on a scalability that no one's proved. Now, you say around the world, lots of other airports are doing this, but I don't think other airports greenwashing this across the globe is the answer to what we're saying. And again, I put the same point to you, that ultimately it is about a risk assessment, and you as a business have managed to put a lot of time and effort into creating the narrative that the risk assessment is more important to get this economic growth than it is to reduce our emissions, despite the fact that the Committee on Climate Change says aviation expansion is incompatible with net zero. So how can you expanding be compatible with the 2030 target, which is even more ambitious than the UK target that the Committee on Climate Change is saying is not possible?
Well, so just to pick up on that last point, and I'll respond on the overall one again. Actually, the Committee on Climate Change doesn't say aviation expansion is incompatible. It says some growth is compatible with reaching net zero, around 30%. The industry believes we can do better than that. Our plan, the plan that I outlined, the 4 elements of the plan, we think would allow 70% growth by 2050. And it's actually the same toolkits in our plan, the efficiency, the SAF, the hydrogen, the greenhouse gas removals are the same ones in the committee's plan. I think the onus is therefore on us, and I will speak for Heathrow, to put forward, and we will have to put forward, a comprehensive plan as part of the development consent order, the infrastructure planning process for expansion, that sets out the steps that we will take and the levers that we can pull as a company to help deliver against each element of that plan, where we will need the right government policies in place, and there will need to be the right checks and balances against that plan over time. But I stand by the point that the benefits of aviation are clear, the climate challenge is clear, and in order to protect those benefits, we're going to have a comprehensive plan to decarbonise.
Sorry, really last question, very brief. You just heard Celeste from the Aviation Environment Federation talk about the fact that this is essentially a bucket, and everyone's going, well, that's not my part of the bucket. And then you're a living example of exactly what she was just talking about.
No, I disagree with that, because what the test we've set ourselves is, so the Committee on Climate Change has published a balanced pathway for carbon emissions from the whole aviation sector, and we are looking to align with that. The industry view and the Heathrow view is we can hit that emissions pathway with more growth than the CCC are projecting, that we need to and can, with the right government policies, scale up those solutions. And we've talked about SAF, but it's also efficiencies and hydrogen and greenhouse gas removals, that we can scale those up more quickly to allow growth. But that's the plan. The plan the Airports National Policy Statement sets us is to demonstrate that we won't compromise the UK's ability to meet its climate obligations. That obligation is net zero, translated through carbon budgets, and that's the plan we'll need to put forward.
I could keep going, but
no, you can't, because we've got a number of other Assembly members who are all poised to come in as well. But can I just pick up on just before I pass on to Assembly Member Foos, who's next? You mentioned both the DCO, the Development Consent Order, which is submitted to government, and you also talked about the planning process. And you mentioned that the various different mitigations that you're talking about will need to be in the DCO. So does that mean that they will be in the public domain, or is that privately submitted to government? How does that work out?
No, I'm talking about, I'm using DCO and planning process interchangeably. And so and we're happy to talk more about our consultation plans, but assuming we are successful in the evaluation process that the government has invited us to take part in, we will be consulting on plans and submitting a DCO, and that will be extensively consulted on and public.
Okay, and then also via the planning process, I'm assuming that what you were talking about is some sort of environment impact assessment of all of the different areas that, some of which have just been characterised as magical thinking, but I think it's fair to say that more work needs to be done on a number of them, the previous panel was talking about. So those areas, there will be some indication in the environment impact assessment as part of the planning process, which is slightly separate from the DCO, granting a DCO, so that when you go to public consultation, people would have an understanding of what they're being consulted over?
Yes. So as part of the development consent order, we need to undertake an environmental impact assessment and assess the potential impacts of the scheme and the measures that we'll take to mitigate those impacts. We will consult extensively on that, locally, more broadly, with all of the statutory consultees that we need to, and put forward those plans. That will be, so yeah, planning process, DCO, I'm seeing as the same.
But it won't just be on things like noise and air pollution, it will be on all the areas you were just running through, greenhouse gas suppression, efficiency, hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, airspace adjustments, different types of landing and takeoff. All of that will be in the public domain?
Yes.
OK, that's very clear. Thank you very much. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thank you, Chair. So, Matt, you said in your, I think, opening statement in terms of 40% SAF contribution, so sustainable aviation fuel, that's the lion's share of that contribution towards you, helping you meet that net zero target effectively for and where you want to go. At the moment, 2023, the number of percentage of flights out of Heathrow flying using SAF was 1%. Where does that currently sit?
Actually, the latest data is for 24, when we were at about 2.5%. And this year we're targeting, increasing that percentage to at least 3%. And that's a result of our SAF incentive. And by the way, it's not individual, so that will be 3% spread across all flights at Heathrow. It arrives in a pipeline and is blended into all the movements. So I think by introducing the landing charge incentive, which we first did in 2022, we've shown that actually by helping to close that price gap with kerosene, you can make it cheaper to use SAF at Heathrow, so that encourages supply. But that we've always recognised that the lever that we can pull at Heathrow can help get the market moving, but ultimately you need the government policies that I described to really scale at speed.
And you've accepted earlier that those two government policies that you wanted to see introduced are being introduced at the moment.
The mandate is in. The revenue certainty mechanism needs to complete in the Lords, but the government has said they're confident that by the end of the year that will be in.
And one of the huge challenges that was raised in the previous panel was around capacity to scale at the level of an ambition that you've talked about. So move from obviously 1% to 2.5%, hopefully 3%. You're talking about effectively, 40% of flights under SAF by what period?
2050. Actually, it would be, because it's probably closer to, at a UK level, 70% of flights operating on SAF by 2050. They save carbon, but not all carbon, so there's what's called a life cycle saving. So it's a very significant increase. But this is I guess, the challenge that the sector faces around the world. People want to fly, and more people want to fly, particularly in some of the emerging markets of the world, but we've got to decarbonise. All of the studies point to SAF as a key part of the solution, which is where there's significant effort on some of the policies I've described in Europe, the US, and other parts of the world to scale the market.
So, I mean, you've identified that 70% of flights from Heathrow need to be, flown with sustainable aviation fuel by 2050 to help you meet your objectives. At the moment, in terms of the capacity, in order to achieve that, land usage and so on, that there seems to be incredibly difficult challenges in terms of actually being able to achieve that, being able to produce that level of sustainable aviation fuel. And clearly you're not just competing with other airports across the UK, but also other land usage requests for and other services that are also trying to reduce their carbon emissions. How is that going to be achievable?
So I'm very happy to answer that. If I just set out quickly the three generations of SAF that we talked about, building on your previous panel. The generation, let's call it first generation SAF, that's in use now is largely from used cooking oil. That's most of the Heathrow all of the Heathrow production. That has a finite quantity globally, is enough for now, but we will then need to move to second generation SAF made from other kinds of waste, municipal, forestry, agricultural waste, industrial waste. And that's the big focus in the UK, because we have waste, chemical engineering expertise, brownfield sites, aviation fuel pipelines, good factor advantages to scale second generation SAF. And then third generation, as one of the previous panel mentioned, is what's called fully synthetic fuel, where you're using green hydrogen and combining it with captured carbon, so effectively recycling carbon in the atmosphere. Through Sustainable Aviation, the group I mentioned earlier, we commissioned independent research showing that actually, we can meet the 70% of fuel needs being provided by SAF, as I mentioned earlier, and that in our balanced central case, about 2/3 of that could be UK produced, and within that 2/3 in the UK, about 1/3 the synthetic fuels I described, and about 2/3 from other kinds of waste-based fuel, and there is sufficient feedstock to enable that. And studies globally show that there is sufficient sustainable biomass for aviation, alongside other uses for materials and chemical processes that need that biomass. But we do also need to scale power to liquid, the synthetic fuels I talked about.
And that's something that takes into account the other services, other airports, other areas of other sectors that require the same.
Yeah, the Sustainable Aviation study I mentioned at a UK level takes those into account, and there have been various studies globally that look at where you need to allocate that sustainable feedstock across the whole global economy. I'm very happy to follow up in writing.
Yeah, it'd be great to receive that. From 2033, emissions from international flights are also going to be taken into account into the UK's climate targets. How are you accounting for, and in terms of measuring that change from 2033 in terms of the figures that you've proposed?
So actually, we already report on all of the flights that leave Heathrow as part of our carbon footprint. As one of the earlier panellists said, that means that flights are around 95 or 96% of the total footprint. And we have backed inclusion of those international flights into carbon budget. So they're accounted for already in the answer I gave Mr. Polansky just earlier, that we will set out a plan based on efficiencies in SAF and hydrogen and removals that address all of those emissions.
Now, one of the things I'm really proud of as an Assembly member is that working with the Mayor, who will have as a legacy delivering clean air for our next generation. Yeah. So it's something that he's absolutely delivered on through ULEZ. Do your proposals put that at risk?
No is the short answer. But let me explain that, because I would absolutely agree with the steps that this Mayor and indeed previous Mayors have taken focused on air quality and the improvements we've seen. And actually, if you look, we have monitored air pollution, NO2 and particulate matter extensively around Heathrow. Actually, I think our first monitor was over 30 years ago next to one of the runways. So we've got a lot of trend data which shows a gradually falling trend over those many years, a particular fall in COVID, as you'd expect, with fewer vehicles on the road and less air traffic. But actually, as traffic has recovered post-COVID, all of the trend data has continued under the pollution limit. So all of the pollution stations around Heathrow, as we heard earlier in central London too, now meet those pollution limits. And that's fundamentally a story of improving vehicles. So if you look at the historic pollution maps of London that you'll be very familiar with, it looks almost like a road map with the pollution spread along the roads. Around Heathrow, aircraft do contribute to pollution, and happy to explore that further, but it disperses quickly as aircraft reach altitude. So the big contribution of the airport the main contribution of the airport is traffic to and from the airport. And as vehicles have got cleaner, both cleaner petrol and diesel, and then increasingly electric vehicles, plus the shift to public transport, we're now at 45% of passengers using public transport, all of those pollution limits are met. The test in the airport's national policy statement is that, and we will need to demonstrate that we won't breach any of those limits as we expand, but we're confident, given the improvements and indeed the ongoing improvements and the shift to EVs, that is possible.
I'll come to the public transport in a moment, but just specifically on the flights, you are saying that you want to increase flights to almost 760,000 flights per year from Heathrow. And you're saying that that will not have a negative impact on the air quality?
I'm saying that all of the pollution stations that we monitor around Heathrow already meet those limits, partly because pollution from aircraft disperses quickly as they reach altitude, and that we will need to demonstrate that we don't breach those limits in future. It's worth saying as well, I talked about this improvement over many years in air pollution. We've had a monitor, I mean, literally within metres of one of our runways, which again shows that downward trend and equally meets limits now, which is really good, strong evidence that aircraft engines have got cleaner as well as vehicles.
And in terms of the public transport access, so obviously the Mayor has within his transport strategy 80% walking, cycling, using public transport. Clearly not many people are going to be walking to the airport if they're going to be catching a flight, maybe cycling in terms of working there. You've got your target of 50% access through public transport. You said it's currently at 45%. What investment are you making or proposing to make in order to make that jump from 45 to 50% in the future?
So there'll be a range of measures there. I mean, worth saying that even in the airport today, we have invested significantly in links, including Heathrow Express, and then the Crossrail, the Elizabeth Line link to Heathrow, which has partly benefited that 45% that I described, as well as in free and subsidised bus services in the local area around Heathrow. Looking ahead, we have said that one or both of two rail schemes will be needed as well. A southern link to the southwestern main line at Staines and a western link to the Great Western Main Line at Slough. And as part of our plans, the CAA, we're economically regulated, the Civil Aviation Authority allows us to recover the cost of investment for where airport passengers benefit directly. So we'd expect to make a contribution where airport users benefit. We also think there's an important conversation with the government about, given some of the wider regional and indeed national benefits of those schemes, about the right government measures to help support and de-risk that investment. So we would absolutely expect to contribute. I can't give you an exact figure today. We'd need to work all of that through. But we also think there's an important role where there are wider benefits for a government role.
Sure, and we've looked at this from a transport committee, so I don't want to go necessarily into that. But presumably, in order, this is obviously the environmental benefits of this, and from the point that you've made, these new routes into Heathrow wouldn't exist unless we required it for people to get to Heathrow. So you'd be contributing, close on to 100% of this investment that's required?
Well, there wouldn't be. They are needed and helpful for expansion, but they have wider benefits. So to make that real with one example, the link to Staines could allow through-running Elizabeth Line trains from Staines along the Elizabeth Line network. Now, clearly, that partly benefits people who want to get to Heathrow, but people in Staines who might want to use the Elizabeth Line. So the exact split of those benefits would need to be worked through.
But it would be the vast majority of the contribution?
I'm not going to be drawn on a specific percentage or number now. Right. I'll say but I will say that we will contribute.
So just quickly then, Matt, what percentage did you contribute towards Crossrail? Because you're very proud of that contribution. I
couldn't give you the percentage off the top of my head, or even the number, but we can get back to you on that.
Okay, great. Becky, you've been patiently waiting there. Thank you so much. I'm just going to move on to the first question. Actually, is just about what your views are about airspace modernisation process.
Yes, thank you. So airspace modernisation is clearly a very important change, and we've heard from the other panellists about how that's going to impact communities near the airport, but more broadly across London. I think it's clear that it presents a real opportunity for improved efficiency. That can bring benefits for carbon reductions. It can bring benefits for noise reductions as well. And I think Paul kind of commented on some of the ways that might happen through reduced stacking and also smoother approach and descent operating procedures. So there are lots of opportunities. I think we also recognise that it is and I hear this, I attend the Noise and Airspace Community Forum that Tracy mentioned earlier every 2 months, and we're very aware that for local communities it is concerning. It was something we've been talking about and the government has been talking about for some time, but there isn't yet the clarity on what it will really mean. So it's a process that's being led by the government and the CAA, as other people have mentioned, and we will provide our input as we can to support that process.
And you talked about the local communities. I represent, obviously, Hillingdon, so you've got those Heathrow villages, Sipson, Cranford, and Harmondsworth, Harlington, and so on. What support are you going to ensure that they are provided for if this set of proposals goes ahead?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because the communities you mentioned are those who are most impacted directly by Heathrow expansion. So firstly, I mean, we're already listening to and talking to those people. When expansion was paused in 2020, we didn't walk away. In fact, during COVID, we made sure that we prioritised particularly community investment activities for those communities, because we knew they really needed it. So we've remained in dialogue with people in those villages, particularly throughout. We're very aware that questions around property compensation are front of mind for those who would be directly impacted. So we've launched a new webpage on our website to give somewhere for people to go. We have a community relations helpline, which any resident can call to ask questions, because I think we very much appreciate that there's been uncertainty for a long time, and there's even more uncertainty now, and I'm not in a position to give that certainty, but we want to be able to at least be here to answer those questions. The impact of the proposals will be something that, as we've discussed earlier with the Chair, will be kind of in detail assessed as part of the environmental impact assessment. And we know that the consultation, which I think we expect would probably happen early 2027, that is a very important opportunity for residents, not only in the Heathrow villages, but more broadly, to understand what the proposals mean, both in terms of impacts, but also importantly in terms of community benefits. So the proposal that we were consulting on in 2018 and 2019 included a lot of investment in new community facilities. And to do that in the most successful way, we need to hear what people want and what they need. So yeah, I think consultation will be very important. And as Tracy mentioned in her response earlier, the way in which we do that will be critical.
So one of the things that you'll regularly hear, I'm sure, Becky, from local residents is their homes are effectively blighted, aren't they? They don't know, in terms of when a property does eventually get sold, it gets sold to, in most cases, a property developer who turns it into a HMO or similar, and so they're losing those communities that they've lived in and for so many years. If the proposals go ahead, of course, those people who currently live there will have the blight taken away, a contribution made for them to be able to move somewhere else. But there will be new communities that are blighted with noise, air pollution and so on. How are you engaging with those communities at the moment in terms of some of the things that you talked about, whether that's community investment or anything else?
Yeah, thank you. So two things I think to talk about there. So firstly is compensation, which is important. So the offer that Heathrow made, which was then reflected in the airport's national policy statement, was for those in both the compulsory purchase zone, but also something called the wider property offer zone, which is an area much broader than where we need to buy properties for the development. The statutory obligation would be for 10% home loss payment on top of the unaffected, so non-blighted value of the property, plus all the moving and costs and so on. Heathrow's offer is 25%, so considerably more generous than 10%. And that offer is available both for those in the CPZ and then the wider area that I mentioned. So I think it's very important that those communities know that that is what Heathrow's offer is, should expansion go ahead. In the meantime, yes, we do our Giving Back programme, which is sort of quite a wide-ranging community investment programme in both the Heathrow villages, but also much more broadly around the airport, and in fact across the 9 boroughs that border the airport. That comprises a range of activities, 3 core areas. The first is connecting communities to nature. So we do some work with through our rangers who go out and make some improvements in local villages. We also work with the London Wildlife Trust and, in fact, Hillingdon Council. Secondly, we're connecting communities to funding. So the Heathrow Community Trust, Heathrow generates about £1 million a year in terms of funding for that, which is then allocated independently by HCT to community groups and charities all across the area. And then thirdly, we are connecting communities to employment and to future careers and education. So we partner with 5 local schools, but also work with secondary schools and colleges all across the 9 boroughs. So all that work is going on now and would absolutely continue and increase.
Thank you, Becca. And just final point, and I won't be asking you for an answer now, but one of the things that comes up time and time again as well is in terms of the local residents' insurances premiums, because actually at the moment the police can't separate out the crimes that happen at the airport from the crimes that happen within Heathrow villages as a ward in general. And so it massively impacts in terms of insurance premiums. I appreciate it's not an environmental issue, but it does affect their mental well-being and obviously how much money they've got to spend. So I appreciate sort of just a bit of follow-up on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to take that away and follow up.
Take that away, that would be much appreciated, because we are running slightly short of time, as I said before. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to welcome Toby Perkins, who's joined us online, who's the chair of the House of Commons Environment Audit Committee. Toby, we've got a couple more questions to put to Heathrow, who we know you've spoken to, and we're very grateful for you joining us so that we can join the work of this committee with the work of your committee. But if you don't mind, we'll just finish off the other couple of questions that we've got. Thank you. Hopefully you'll be able to stay with us. I think our time for you to arrive is about now, so we're not completely behind. Assembly Member Gareth Roberts, you are next.
Thank you, Chair. Just staying with the issue of engagement with communities locally, so one for Becky. Over the summer, there was a certain amount of controversy, not for the first time, about the organisation Back Heathrow, which I understand is funded by Heathrow, at least in part. How much do you fund Back Heathrow by?
I believe we are the main funder of Back Heathrow.
Okay, so how much is that?
I don't have that number to hand, but would be happy to share it.
Could you share it with us in writing? That would be useful. The controversy surrounded leaflets which were going out, which showed that it was from Back Heathrow, but didn't really give any indication that Back Heathrow was funded by Heathrow Airport. It's a time when transparency is all the more important, particularly on a sensitive issue like this. Do you think that that's a mistake, that they're not open and transparent about where their funding comes from?
So firstly, I think we absolutely agree that transparency on all of these issues is very important, and it's something that we've been in dialogue with Kisha about, who hold us to account on that regularly. Secondly, I don't think we've ever hidden the fact that we are the funder of Back Heathrow. So I think it's an issue that we're very comfortable being transparent about.
Excellent. So, I mean, the issue which you'll, I'm sure, recognise is that whilst you may be transparent, the hundreds of thousands of people who will have received this leaflet might not necessarily know that. They are not as close to the issue as perhaps you and I are. Given that you're so enthused about transparency, I think that's entirely the right thing. For future publications coming from Back Heathrow, will you make it clear that you expect as a condition of funding that any future literature, websites or any communication with the public clearly states that you are funding Back Heathrow, and if they don't put that on their literature, that you will cease funding them?
So, as I'm sure you're aware, Back Heathrow are an independent organisation, separate
yes, but it's your
company.
Money.
But we will, of course, raise that issue with them, and we'd be happy to discuss it with them.
Thank you. And I mean, it's all very well having the discussion, which we won't be part of. It would be nice to get an indicative idea that you might be willing to take this as a serious proposition going forward to them.
So we're absolutely taking your comments seriously, and we'll take them away to discuss with them. I don't think it's appropriate for me to make a more a stronger commitment. In the interest of transparency, I want to be open and honest with you.
Excellent. Perhaps we can get an update in writing, maybe within about 3 months, once you've had those conversations.
We'd be happy to provide an update in writing in due course.
Thank you. Just turning to... actually, I'm going to move off from night flights to talk about direct impacts on particularly London's green spaces, including Richmond Park and Kew Gardens. I should declare an interest, Chair, on Richmond Park as a trustee of the Royal Parks. How will you ensure that places of tranquility such as these are not impacted by the proposals for additional flights?
So, You'll be aware that noise policy will require assessment of impacts on both communities and also green spaces. So I think the first thing to say is that both noise impacts but also any other biodiversity impacts in the local area would be robustly assessed within the environmental impact assessment. Secondly, there are specific requirements around biodiversity net gain, for example, which would apply to Heathrow as a large-scale infrastructure project. So that would result in a 10% increase in biodiversity from the development. I think with regards to the impact of noise, this is something that the priorities are set out within air navigation guidance, so ANG, which is the government guidance on how to approach noise policy. And so we will be informed by that, but also by views that are given back to us in consultation. And that's, I think, one of the important roles of consultation with communities, is to understand what are the places and the facilities that are of value to them, so that that can be taken into account in the design, both of the development at the airport, but also in airspace design.
Thank you. Just touching specifically on Richmond Park, which I'm sure you'll know is a SSSI, Site of Special Scientific Interest, and it's home to rare bat species particularly. So what specific additional steps can you take to ensure that those areas in particular, because general environmental concerns, of course, need to be considered, and for species of all types, but for those very specific, those very rare species which inhabit specific locations, what additional steps do you intend to take to ensure that they're as undisturbed as possible?
So firstly, rare species have particular protections under environmental legislation. So Heathrow would, of course, ensure that we comply with all relevant requirements and provide any additional mitigations that are identified through the environmental impact assessment. I think it's probably too early to talk about kind of very specific species, because we do not yet know what the impact in those specific areas would be, but I can provide reassurance that we would ensure that all measures that we're required to take are taken, and that any impact on those species would be specifically understood and addressed as part of the process.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Roberts. Finally, our last questions to you from Assemblymember Small-Edwards.
Thank you and good afternoon, panellists. My question is to Becky. It's just, what are the next steps regarding the plans? When do you expect to hear back if your proposal has been accepted?
I think that's actually a question for Matt as our programme lead for expansion, so I'll ask him to respond.
So the government invited proposals which we submitted by the end of July. They are still completing their evaluation process, and we don't have a firm timescale when that will be completed yet.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm assuming it's going to be somewhat sooner than the last time you came in to see us, Matt, which I think was in 2019. So I'm sure it won't take 6 years for them to complete their evaluation. But obviously, in that case, we'll all just have to wait for the officials to complete that. Can I just say thank you very much to our two guests from panel 2 from Heathrow Airport. As our next guest is online, I'm proposing to move straight over to Toby Perkins, who, as I said, is the chair of the Environment Audit Committee. You're very welcome to stay, and to stay where you are and listen to his answers to our further questions. Alternatively, if you feel the pressing need to leave, we also won't be terribly offended if you do that. And we do say that to all of our guests. Toby, thank you so much for waiting for a short time there while we finished off our questions directed to Heathrow. And we're really grateful for you being able to join us so that we can join together what we're doing with what the Environment Audit Committee has already done. And the first question, which is from me, are there any key learnings from your investigation that you would want to share with the committee? Is there anything specific that we should hear about where you may have got further than we have today?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation to address you. I think it's probably worth saying, firstly, apologise that I can't be with you in person, but we had another important debate here in Parliament. But just to firstly give some context, the Environmental Audit Committee is a cross-party committee. It has a majority of Labour members on it, but it has members from Liberal Democrats, Conservatives, Green and Reform parties. It is, we haven't yet published our report, but we have basically agreed it, and we were able to, on the basis of the evidence, come to something that people with a variety of different views on the desirability of Heathrow were able to agree to. I think, obviously, because it hasn't yet been published, I can't go into specific recommendations, but in terms of the learnings, I think there was a tremendous amount that we heard. I think we discussed in some depth the purpose of doing this inquiry at this moment in time was to be able to say ahead of the government's response to Heathrow's plans particularly and the other expansion plans that they have from other airports predominantly around London and the South East. Firstly, was it credible that there could be expansion of Heathrow and the other airports consistent with the government's commitments on climate change and emissions, and technologically, and if so, who had to do what steps in order to be able to achieve that. Now, I think I would say that in terms of what technologically is possible, it is perfectly possible for there to be expansion of Heathrow that is consistent with the environmental commitments. Do we yet have the commitments from government that we would need and from the industry in order to say that that's going to happen? Answer to that will be at this stage no. So I think we had some very interesting representations in terms of technologies. We had some interesting learnings in terms of noise and air pollution. Go into any of those that you want. We heard from a very wide variety of experts, of people who have a particular interest as local constituents close to Heathrow, and of course from those lobbying in favour of it also.
That's really interesting, because I think you probably went in more depth than we have today into the potential technologies which you've just referred to. What information were you given about the technologies that might help with, for example, reducing emissions, and/or technologies that might help in terms of noise reduction, or helping to keep the impact on air quality under control? Because I think those are all different things.
Yeah, they are. So, I mean, as I suspect you've already been told, we have seen an expansion in the amount of aircraft utilising Heathrow in recent years, which has coincided with a reduction in emissions and in noise. And that's because basically planes are getting quieter and more efficient anyway. One of the things we heard is that there is a huge number of different contributory factors which could all reduce emissions, and the Whittle Laboratory has done some really interesting work on mapping and modelling all of those different measures. A reduction in the age of the fleet that aircraft use will make a big difference in terms of emissions. The more modern planes are much more environmentally friendly. They're also much quieter. So bringing forward aircraft utilising more modern planes would make a big factor. I think Heathrow almost certainly will have told you that one of the causes of emissions is the amount of stacking and queuing over Heathrow. So additional runway space may reduce, or they would argue will reduce, the amount of time that aircraft spend in the air, effectively hovering over Heathrow, and so that can be useful. They would also argue that there are many people who come to the UK having done the long haul part of their journey to Paris or to Amsterdam, and then travelling on to Heathrow because of the lack of capacity, and so that there could be benefits in that regard. We were also told that there's some really exciting developments in terms of contrails, which is to do with the routes that aircraft go. Sometimes an aircraft moving simply 100 miles to the left or flying 100 miles, 100 meters higher can make a real difference to the atmospheric conditions that aircraft flies through. And actually that 1 in 20 aircraft will have contrails, but those contrails will be 50% of all the emissions damage that we have. And so actually just simply flying, being better informed and flying very marginally different routes could have major differences to the emissions that we have. I think one of the things that came across...
Sorry, Toby, I think that's really interesting because these are some of the points that we didn't manage to get into with our guests this afternoon and with Heathrow. One of the things that we did get into was the need to increase the use of sustainable aviation fuel to about 40% of what is being used by aircraft flying in and out. And you just referred to Heathrow and government and industry not yet being at the point where they're sort of committing to things, and I assume that would partly impact on sustainable aviation fuel in what you were talking about. I mean, it was a slight concern to us because in 2023, 1% of fuel at Heathrow was SAF. 2024, they're estimating it will be 2.5%, and for 2025 it will rocket to 3%, which still means that 97% is not sustainable aviation fuel. Did you get a sense in the discussions about the other things that you were mentioning of where we were going to with that? Because I think the 40% SAF was quite a concern to us, and that is the biggest area in terms of the percentages to address these issues. 40% was the biggest area, so I just wondered if you could touch on that for us in a bit more detail.
So I think the first thing to say, and apologies if I'm telling you something you already know, but sustainable aviation fuel creates exactly the same, almost exactly the same emissions as kerosene. The reason it's considered to be sustainable is that you are reusing a product that already exists rather than burning brand new kerosene. But in terms of the actual emissions, it will be very similar. So I think one of the things that we heard was at the Whistler Laboratory was up to about 20% of sustainable aviation fuel. We are indisputably reducing the carbon footprint of aviation. Once you move much beyond that, it becomes much more questionable, because what you start to do is use sustainable biofuels and other waste products that potentially might be being used for other processes instead. So it might be being used for heating or electricity generation and so on. So firstly, you might be using it in aviation, but then preventing it being used in other factors. And the second thing is you might end up having to grow trees simply to cut them down in order to feed the amount of aviation that we needed. So I think on the committee that the government are over-relying on sustainable aviation fuel. It certainly has an important role to play. But there is evidence that if we move beyond 20% of aviation, and as you rightly say, that's way ahead of where we are so far, then it becomes more questionable whether you get those same economic benefits. So we think that sustainable aviation fuel is absolutely a crucial part of this, but it is not by any means the silver bullet. We think demand management is also a tool government should consider, as recommended by the Climate Change Committee. We believe that steps to reduce the age of the fleet and to incentivise aircraft to use newer fleet is important. There's an industrial strategy part of this. There is a huge waiting list for new aircraft. We aren't, the whole world isn't building enough aircraft at the moment. And then also looking at things like what aircraft do we use? We shouldn't be using 747s for short journeys to Western Europe. Let's save those for long haul. So there's a huge number of different things, some of which are within the gift of the airports, some of which are going to require government and intra-government involvement, and some of this will be happening whether we build Heathrow's third runway or not. There will continue to be a demand for greater aviation, and some people would say this will either happen at Heathrow or elsewhere. We can lose this business to France and to the Netherlands, but the flights will still come. So I think it's important to be realistic about the extent to which this one runway will make all the difference, if you like.
That's really interesting. We also touched on the issue of hydrogen and how it's created, and whether the same arguments, I guess, about sustainable aviation fuel and whether or not it really is a sustainable fuel in any size, shape or form. And then we also touched on, I think, more with the first panel than with Heathrow, whether or not we should, you were talking about short-haul flights using 747s. Our first panel actually said, should we be doing more to actually make it that we don't have any flights at all domestically, and that, it's horribly expensive if you want to get a train from London to Caithness, or Aberdeen, but if flying is much, much cheaper, is that right? Did you look into hydrogen, and did you look into whether or not we should be trying to reduce or, in fact, eradicate domestic flights as well in the committee?
So I think we only touched upon hydrogen fairly briefly. I think that in terms of realistically saying that technology will have developed sufficiently by 2035, or that there will be a credible answer on hydrogen in time for the government to make this decision, is probably unrealistic. I think we heard evidence that there should be real investigation into new technologies, but I suspect government will have made their decision before we've learned a great deal more about hydrogen. Sorry, just remind me the second point you were making.
It was about the domestic flights and whether or not we should
reduce
reduce them or eradicate
them. As a kind of Northern MP, I feel really strongly about. We had, one of the things that we put to Heathrow was that, was this centering growth even more in London and the South East? And what we need to see is the regional airports. It's only fair to reflect that airports like Manchester and Glasgow are supporting the Heathrow proposals, and they do see that if you can get on a plane at Glasgow, change at Heathrow, and get to to parts of Africa and so on, that it will be beneficial for their airports also. But I do, as a Northern MP, think it is ludicrous that I can fly to many Western European destinations cheaper than I can get a train to London, which takes an hour and 50 minutes. And the extent to which we've subsidised over the years aircraft at the expense of rail travel is I think pretty damning sense of our failure. So there's a number of things that we looked at in terms of domestics. That, I think we would share your view that, with the exception of maybe Scotland, in the most of England certainly, and Wales, we should be able to travel to Heathrow by train. We also, recognise the point that if you're travelling from the southwest, you travel past Heathrow, spend 45 minutes on a train into the central London to get another train 45 minutes
come back out.
And so, actually improving both road and particularly rail links. If Heathrow is, and Heathrow themselves would agree with this, but if Heathrow is positioning itself as the country's airport, then I should be able, travelling from Sheffield or Chesterfield, to be able to access Heathrow. Instead, I have to go into the centre of one of the busiest cities in the world in order to get out to Heathrow again. So I think that the government's got a lot of questions to answer around that as well.
We were, as a committee, also a cross-party committee, we're trying very hard to steer clear of the transport connections issues, because we also have a transport committee here, and we don't like to step on their toes. Finally, if I could just ask you, you talked about your report, and so two questions. Do you have a likely publication date? You obviously said you wanted to get that into the mix while the government is making the decision, so I'm hoping you're going to say that's going to be ready fairly soon, and I think some of us would probably like to receive it. And are there next steps for your scrutiny in this area? I assume as Heathrow or whoever wins the, gets the green light, if you like, to go forward, that you will look, you'll scrutinise, whatever is submitted for the DCO and planning and environmental impacts and all that sort of thing. Would I be right in assuming that?
Yeah. So firstly, I mean, I hope the report is imminent. I certainly would expect it to be published before the end of October. We broadly have agreement now on that, and we're just going through the mechanics of getting that published. So yes, the report is imminent. What happens next? Well, after that, we expect government to respond to the findings, and they're tasked with doing that within 3 months. What the committee formally will do as a committee post that, I think partly depends on what the government announce. But I'm sure that members of the committee will be very involved in any legislative proposals that come in, and make sure that we're feeding back on that. So that's really when and what I anticipate will happen from there.
Well, look, thank you so much, and we completely appreciate that you had other engagements in the House of Commons, so we absolutely don't mind you being beamed into our chamber to join us for this meeting. It's been very illuminating, so it looks as though your committee delved more deeply into some areas while we were looking at others, so that's really rounded out what we've been talking about. So I'd like to thank you for your contribution this afternoon, as well as all of our other guests. We've now reached the end of all of our discussions this afternoon, and obviously you're also free to go if you wish, because we've just got a couple of very short administrative items to finish off now. I never normally like to miss an administrative item, but on this occasion you'll make a special exception. Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate Thanks, David. Thanks very much. Can I ask the committee to note the report that we received and the discussion that we've just held with all of our guests? Noted. And could I also ask that you delegate authority to me as the chair, in consultation with all of the party group lead members, to agree any output arising from our discussions? Agreed. Thank you. Item 8 on the agenda is the Environment Committee work programme for the rest of 25-26. It's on pages 127 to 130. Could I ask the committee to note our work programme? Noted. Thank you. And finally, the last item on the agenda is the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for just in a few weeks' time, the 4th of November at 10 a.m. And it's here. So I have no further urgent business, so I now declare this meeting is closed.